Okay, so today I wanted to respond to this video that I saw. I actually watched it yesterday, but throughout watching it, there were just so many like points that I saw and so many like untruths that this video said. And I looked around for the reactions. Video is like from 3 years ago during the pandemic and stuff. And I looked around YouTube for like all the reactions and stuff, but like everyone that was reacting to it was just kind of like surfacing at it, like nobody else had reacted to it like properly. And he also has a video on the Cold War that Midwestern Midwestern Marx responded to on YouTube. This dude, yeah, this guy, these two videos, I watched the first one and it gave me the idea of responding to this. But yeah, I saw he did this video on the Russian Revolution, and I'm going to respond to it. And yeah,
68% off a 2-year plan. Also, commemorating the weirdest bromance in history. Get your new character pins and Russian Revolution merch available now. Link down below. Hey Jimmy, it's the 1800s, an exciting time to be alive. Why don't you get out there and explore the world? Gee whiz, Mom, thanks. This place is amazing. Where am I? Why, you're in France, my boy. Here we come up with wacky new ways of running a country. Liberty, equality, fraternity. Whoa, welcome to the United Kingdom. Here we invented the train. Hello, aboard! Holy smokes, you're in a German factory, my friend. Here we harness fire and coal to create all these sexy lederhosen. This is incredible. I can't wait to see where I'll end up next. Where am I? You're in Russia. Have I gone back in time? No, this is just how it is. Are you a farmer? Worse. Technically, my landlord owns me, which makes me a serf. I'm scared. You should be, because I haven't eaten in 4 days, and you look pretty tasty. Hey, Jimmy, how are your travels? I hate you! Russia.
so just right off the bat, these types of channels on YouTube that like talk about history with like all these cute cartoons and stuff, they're not bad in a vacuum, but my problem with them is how they are also ideology while usually pretending to like be just fun, ahistorical, like not ahistorical, but like just for fun, just jokes. And like usually you see in the comments of these types of videos, like when people criticize the stuff that they're saying as like not true, the common defense is always like, oh, it's just for fun, it's just jokes. But like by taking the stances that they do and like by talking about things how they talk about them, usually ends up like upholding or spreading like certain views and certain like perspectives that are usually very pro-West, pro-US, just because that's like the dominant historical consensus. But like usually watching these videos and like reading about the actual history, they couldn't be further apart. So like whenever you see videos like this, the same thing with like Real Life Lord, same thing with like all those other guys, like it's never like a legit sort of like it's never actually informing. Usually it does the opposite. It gets people to stop thinking and like be less informed about the reality because it's like entertainment. But like you can inform history without being you can inform history and still be entertaining. But like what these channels do is usually not that.
In the 19th century, feudal, underdeveloped, and stuck in the past, while the rest of Europe had been modernizing and improving their citizens' lives, Russia's rulers were taking a different approach. My lord, we're falling behind the rest of Europe. It's time to industrialize.
Also important to note that like just because the rest of Europe was industrializing and improving like people's lives, that usually wasn't like uniform. Like all of society's lives weren't improved. Like child labor laws were still not a thing. Like most peasants and workers in Western Europe still lived awful, terrible lives, just like in Russia. It was just worse in Russia because obviously uh, the physical sort of the geography was a lot bigger and cities were further apart, things like that. It's like the countryside in Russia was worse, but it doesn't mean that like England or France, all these other places didn't have the same sort of material conditions that were in Russia. It was just like more pronounced in Russia.
Give the people rights and share your power. Russian czars had no time for pathetic ideas like liberty and modernization because they were too busy having the time of their lives. While the
Like, you always talk about the liberty, equality, brotherhood with France. Like all those things were for the landowning classes. Like it's the same with America, where like it's land of the free. Like it's such a democracy, but like black people couldn't vote, slaves couldn't vote. If you were a woman, you couldn't vote. Like all of those freedoms were usually for landowning men. So even in this video where he talks about like, oh, the Western Europe was free and liberated and modern, but Russia wasn't, like that still wasn't like universal.
were breaking their backs in the fields. The czars held all the power, and they didn't have to listen to anyone. Want to run the country like a backwards feudal kingdom while the rest of Europe outpaces you militarily and economically? Go right ahead. Want to keep the people uneducated so they don't get any ideas? There's no one to stop you. Want to keep exporting grain even when there's a massive famine causing hundreds of thousands to die? That is your God-given right. While all of this was great for the Tsar, if you were literally anybody else, it probably sucked because Russia was falling behind. If they were to keep up with Europe, they'd need a strong ruler with some big ideas. Oh look, here comes one now. Hey everyone, it's me, Tsar Alexander II, and I've got some big news. I'm releasing you all from your serfdom. You're all free. Yes! Yep, I'm the best. Oh, there is one thing though. I spoke to your local lords and they weren't happy about losing all their free labor. So as a compromise, you're all gonna have to pay them back a near impossible amount of money for the next 49 years. Expect your lives to barely change. Okay, bye. Now I know what you're thinking. This Tsar Alexander II seems like a pretty cool guy. He's trying to reform the country and get Russia on the right path. Everyone must love this guy, right? Wrong. Why does one man...
It's surprising that he thinks anyone would think that after hearing what he just said. Like, very few sort of critically thoughtful people would hear that and think that, like, oh, he's actually trying to reform, and not that he's just giving very minor concessions to the landowning classes and not really trying to change society, which is why society didn't change. Like,
man get to decide the fate of everyone in the country. This whole system is dumb. Somebody should do something. Like what? Like kill the Tsar. You're gonna kill the Tsar? Well, me? No. I'm busy. I was kind of hoping you'd do it. Okay. See? The people love me. They're throwing flowers, confetti, and high-grade explosives. Okay, Nicholas, your grandfather has a mild case of being blown up by a terrorist, and he's not looking too hot, so we're gonna go say our goodbyes, okay? No, it'll be too scary for him. Nonsense, it won't be scary at all. We're just gonna say a quick goodbye. Ready? Boy, look at me. The people did this to me, and one day, they'll do it to you! See? Wasn't scary at all. So Alexander II was dead, but luckily, they had another Alexander lying around, Alexander III, and he felt his dad's reforms had weakened the Tsar's authority. Russia was massive, and as a result, had many ethnic minorities. Non-Russians, more interested in their own cultural heritage than in loving me? Isn't it great? So much beautiful culture and diversity in our great nation. Alexander thought all these minorities should be a little more Russian, and thereby loyal to him. So he repressed religious minorities. He repressed non-Russians. He introduced the Okhrana, a secret police force that repressed anybody who thought having a Tsar was dumb. If Alexander II was the great reformer, Alexander III was the great repressor. Now that's how you run a country. Hey Dad? Ugh, great. It's my son Nicholas, who I like to call a girly girl because he's so weak and pathetic.
it's notable that he acknowledges at this point that until Alexander III, Russia had actually been relatively sort of with respect to like their ethnic minorities, they weren't explicitly genocidal the way you see in like America. Like if you look at Russia today and Central Asia today, all those ethnic minorities, most of them still exist. They still have their cultures. They still have their languages, thanks to the effort of the Soviet Union. But most of them still exist. They're still preserved. But like in America, the like Western settlers encountered native people there too, but they weren't content to just expand their political authority while preserving like the existing people there and like concentrating all their populations in the sort of like coastal regions where they arrived. But they just decided to just kill everyone instead and like forcefully settle those people. That's the thing that makes it settler colonialism compared to like just building an empire normally through expanding territory. Because although like white Russians like in this area and stuff, they expanded their territory eastward, but like all those native populations they met, they simply just brought them under their political authority, but they didn't feel the need of like executing them or stuff like that. Obviously things like pogroms for minorities still existed because obviously people were still racist and stuff, but it wasn't like an official policy to like repress and like erase those populations until he claims, this guy. I'm not like an expert on Tsarist Russia, but like sounds correct.
When are you gonna grow up? You still look like a girly girl to me. But Dad, I grew a beard. Yeah, an ugly girly girl beard. If Nicholas was to one day be Tsar, he needed his dad to teach him how to run the country. But his dad instead suggested that Nicholas go somewhere else. So Nicholas went to Japan, got an edgy dragon tattoo, had his head sliced off by a policeman, and then came home. Now will you teach me how to rule? I suppose it's time. Okay, there's a lot you need to know before becoming Tsar. Uh-oh. What? I've got kidney inflammation. Oh no! Upon his father's death, a totally unprepared Nicholas II ascended to the Russian throne. He wasn't a reformer like his grandfather, nor was he a repressor like his dad. Nicholas was Nicholas, timid, easily swayed, and more interested in doing whatever the hell this is. Or this. Or this. He wasn't ready to rule, and he himself admitted it, saying, "I'm not yet ready to be Tsar. I know nothing of the business of ruling." Bit of an awkward time to bring it up. However, Nicholas firmly believed that he was chosen by God to be Russia's big daddy, and while he doubted his ability to rule, he was going to give it his best shot. And hey, who knows, maybe he wouldn't be so bad after all. To get things off to a good start, Nicholas promised free pretzels and beer to a huge crowd in Moscow to celebrate his coronation, so enticing a proposition to starving peasants that the ensuing stampede left nearly 1,500 people dead. What the hell happened? We're not sure, but you're scheduled to go party with the French at 8 o'clock. Shouldn't I stay here out of respect for the people? When have Russians respected the people? Nicholas's decision to go party with the French immediately tarnished his image. Some were calling him Nicholas the Bloody. The Tsars had been partying hard at the expense of the people for long enough. They'd emancipated the serfs, but failed to lift them out of poverty. They used their secret police to crack down on anyone who might criticize them, and they'd failed to modernize and give the people rights, something the rest of Europe had begun doing over a century ago. The rule of the Tsars was quickly becoming outdated, and more Russians began wondering if there was a better way. For many, the solution was simple. Just look to the West. Republics, democracies, and constitutional monarchies galore. But a small growing group rejected that for an even better idea, a little something they called communism. Take Vladimir Lenin, an intelligent member of Russia's middle class, and also a massive ill-tempered jerk. If you disagreed with him about anything, he wasn't afraid to call you out. You fat-headed, simple-minded...
So this is something that he does very often, where like when he talks about anyone that was a communist, he sort of like tries to cartoonify them, like almost Family Guy. He like parodies them, like makes them seem like petulant and absurd. He does this a lot over the videos, and I just like it adds nothing. Like you can say that it's entertaining, but it's not really informative, and like it makes caricatures of these like three-dimensional historical figures. So I'm just like, it's kind of it's like an interesting choice, because he hasn't done that so far with like any other figures that he talks about, real people. But like as soon as he gets to Lenin, the first thing he says is like, oh, this guy was a fucking idiot.
Vapid, cockeyed imbecile! Tenderheart Bear is a far superior Care Bear to Bedtime Bear! And he was no stranger to political unrest either. His older brother was executed for plotting to kill the Tsar, and Lenin himself was expelled from university for participating in a student protest. But how did Lenin go from being a middle-class nerd to the arbiter of socialist divinity? Well, to tell that story, we first need to go back a few decades to when a man named Karl Marx wrote a manifesto explaining how capitalism is a system whereby the stinky bourgeoisie oppressed and exploited the working masses, and that only through class warfare could the workers rise up and instate a communist utopia. Now go back forward a few decades to Lenin.
So this is something that he says a lot, actually. This is like the main thing that made me want to respond to this video. Whenever he mentions communism, he talks about like a communist utopia. And the thing with Marx and Engels is that they didn't create the idea of communism. Like things like workers' rights and things like proletarian sort of like class awareness and things like the idea of class itself, these ideas already existed. Even the Communist Manifesto, it was an existing communist party that went to Marx, because Marx was like a thinker, philosopher of his time. He was respected. These guys went to Marx and Engels and asked them to like write their Communist Manifesto. And the idea of like communism as a utopia is something that Marx and Engels, especially Engels, criticized. Like there were utopian communists and there were Marx and Engels. And Marx and Engels believed that communism, specifically Marxist interpretations of how to achieve communism, was supposed to be rooted in science. They called it materialism. So this thing that he mentions very often in both of these videos, where like oh, Lenin believed in a communist utopia, like it's the exact opposite of reality, because Lenin hated people who had utopian visions of communism, and it led them to ignore their material conditions. Marx, Lenin, all these people were materialists. They looked at the real world. They didn't look at like they didn't just want to believe in ideals. So when he talks about communist utopia, he's not talking about the people he's referring to were not Marx, because Marx and Engels, they looked at the world. They called it scientific socialism. It was a scientific materialist conception of reality. They didn't want to believe in ideals. They wanted to believe in like, what can we achieve in the real world? So that's just like the biggest misunderstanding that he has when it comes to like communism. And he says it like many times in this video.
Reading that manifesto and loving it. But publicly admitting you loved Marx and not Russia's Big Daddy would get you the cruelest punishment imaginable. Exile to Siberia. Enjoy exile, where you'll live with your wife, chill around town, and secretly write socialist newspapers. Hey, that doesn't sound so bad. And your mother-in-law is going to live with you. No! Once Lenin finished his stint in Siberia, he left Russia for Europe, where he was free to hang out with other Russian Marxists and talk about how great communism was. Now today, you might hear the word communism and think of this.
So it's interesting that he acknowledges that people, when they think of communism, they think of like, obviously he shows a bunch of like Cold War, Eastern Europe imagery.
But that's not how intellectuals living under a tough czarist regime saw it. To them, communism promised a land where all were equal, where workers weren't exploited, and even people like you could get a girlfriend. So Lenin joined a party of Russian.
So what he just said there is just completely wrong. Communism, even the people like at the time, first of all, these people weren't all like in agreements, but like the people that Lenin hung out with specifically, they didn't see communism as a utopia where everyone was equal. This is like a very Western misunderstanding of like what communism is. The idea, the fundamental principle of communism is that society doesn't have any scarcity anymore. Because basically, if you look at our modern world today, the reason why there is so much like inequality and stuff is because like there is no abundance. There is a lot of exploitation. There's a lot of like inequality. There's a lot of scarcity. And the way that materials are rationed under scarcity in capitalism is by being like price. So if you can afford food, then you buy food. And if you can't afford food, then you don't buy food. That's how it functions. The point of communism is to create a society where there's no more scarcity because the capacity to produce things is so high that people can just take what they need, and there's no need for any sort of exploitation in the form of like selling your labor or things like that. It's like if society gets to a point where it's producing so much that it's abundant, then there is no need for exploitation in the form of selling your labor. That's like the Cliff Notes version of what communism is supposed to be. It's not just like a utopia where everyone is equal. Like it's a utopia where nobody wants for anything because the society is abundance. There's no scarcity.
Communists living in Europe, and he founded a communist newsletter that was smuggled into Russia to try to radicalize the people. However, not everyone in the Socialist Party agreed with Lenin. In fact, they disagreed with him on a lot of issues, and Lenin was so uncompromising that he caused a split in the party. During one conference, a heated debate broke out, and Lenin was unwilling to give an inch. You pig-ignorant, half-witted, fatuous morons! Cereal is a soup! Listen, Lenin, you're a smart guy, but you have no idea what you're talking about. We're out of here. All in favor of cereal being a soup? Hey, would you look at that? We're in the majority. So Lenin set up his own faction within the party he called the majority, or Bolshevik if you're speaking Russian. And the other faction became known as the minority, or Menshevik. And oddly, the majority were often in the minority, and the minority in the majority.
This is something that he said that just made me completely insane. Like there is no functional, like if you search for Bolshevik, like you just go to Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is hardly the most communist source like ever. The point of his split was that basically he wanted people that were committed to revolution. He wanted people that were going to dedicate their whole lives to like socialism. He didn't want like a big tent. The thing that the Mensheviks wanted was they wanted a big tent party that would have like broad support. And Lenin was big on like party discipline, democratic centralism. Those were like his ideas. So the reason for the split was, aside there were many other things that caused them to split. It wasn't just Lenin being like a like petulant asshole the way he says. But the point is that obviously there weren't fewer Bolsheviks than Mensheviks. That does even, why would they call themselves that? And why would the Mensheviks agree to call themselves that if they were fewer? Like if they were more? It's just nonsense. Like I don't understand. I guess it's supposed to be funny that like LOL Lenin was stupid. They were fewer, but they still call themselves majority. Like no, the Bolsheviks had majority supports. He says, I guess he says that they were often the minority, but like it's just such a strange thing to bring up. Like it's their name. Like
The Mensheviks were less radical, whereas Lenin wanted the Bolsheviks to be loyal to him and his uncompromising ideas.
this is the strange thing also that he says where it's like Lenin wanted Bolsheviks to be loyal to him specifically, but it's like that is not that's not the point of any of this. Lenin was not making a party for himself. He understood that revolutionary movements need leaders, yes, but the idea was for them to be loyal to the theory of Marxism, the theory of Marxism applied to Russia's conditions. That's what the point was. He saw that people that were not Bolsheviks, more often than not, they were willing to compromise on those theories, to sell themselves out, to dilute their radical sort of potential. And this was like frustrating to Lenin because Lenin wanted the party to be united to work as a whole. Not that the party shouldn't have debates. The party should have debates, but when one idea has a majority of support, everyone should support that idea like in unison. That's what democratic centralism means. Democratic centralism doesn't mean that someone is like a dictator and just gives edicts and everyone obeys. Democratic centralism means everyone agrees, but there shouldn't be factions. Once we come to a consensus, everyone has to agree. Or if something wins by majority votes, like if a party has 12 members and 7 members say the country should have stop signs, and 5 people say the country should have yield signs. If those 7 members are more, then everyone should agree that the party has the country should have substance. It shouldn't be that those five people should go and form a faction of a yield sign party. Like, no, the party should be united. That's what democratic centralism means. But he misunderstands it as like Lenin wanted like everyone to be loyal to him, which is just like very strange. Lenin was extremely modest. He was not someone that like wanted like statues built of him and things. Like he resisted those things, but people acknowledged him as a leader, and they were the ones that chose to do those things. So it's like it's a very common Western misconception of like all these socialist leaders, Lenin, Stalin, Ho Chi Minh, Mao, they all reveled in their personality cults. But like, no, these people were most of the time, they're very modest people, but they had mass appeal. And part of the byproduct of having mass appeal is you're very popular, people like you. And that's just like a fact of reality. It's the same thing in America with like George Washington. Like, George Washington didn't he's famous for not wanting to be a king, but he was so popular and had so much mass appeal that people essentially made him a king. They named a bunch of things after him. They carved his face into a statue into a mountain in South Dakota. Like, that's just how these things work. I don't know why these people just pretend to not understand these concepts.
And if you weren't loyal, well then you're gonna get a big brain beatdown. Mensheviks worried that Lenin's attitude could lead to a one-man dictatorship. But come on, does this guy look like a dictator to you?
So this is the thing that he says where it's like Mensheviks were worried that Lenin's attitude could lead to a dictatorship. Like, Mensheviks had a lot of reasons for disagreeing with the Bolsheviks, but like this idea that he was accused of like wanting to be a despot, that's just clearly not founded in anything. Like, if they said that, it was disparaging, of course, yes, but like it's not a fact of reality that like Lenin wanted to be a dictator, and he puts a picture of Lenin looking like scary and evil. Like, does this guy look like a dictator? It's just ideology. Like, there's nothing informative being said here. It's just very strange. And Lenin's idea of like party discipline, meaning that people should be loyal to the ideas of the party, being turned into people should be loyal to him, was just very like it's a very Western projection of like political thought of like, oh, if a party has ideas, then the figurehead of that party must be the person like everyone is loyal to, and not just like the ideas. It's just very strange.
For now, Lenin remained in Europe, writing his socialist newspaper and impatiently awaiting an opportunity to overthrow the Tsar and bring communist utopia to Russia.
Yeah, he says it again, communist utopia. Like, nobody, Russia, he himself acknowledged throughout the beginning part of the video that Russia was a backwards peasant agrarian country with no industrialization, very low literacy rates. Like, nobody expected that if Lenin took power, like the country would just turn to utopia. Like, this is just completely silly. I don't know how people can just take this as face value and like just nod in agreement.
Cool. A free hat. Who the heck are you? I'm definitely not a Russian secret police officer spying on Marxists. Oh crap, I don't want secret police watching me. Then you, my friend, should use NordVPN. Do you like having your identity stolen?
Yeah, so
if yes,
like
you need therapy. If no, you need NordVPN. NordVPN has thousands of super fast servers in 62 countries that you can connect to keep you and your data secure when using the web. NordVPN.com/oversimplified. And as always, you'll be supporting my channel. So muchos arigatos, mon petit pois. Now where was I? Oh yeah. A timid, easily swayed czar, a massive ill-tempered jerk, impatiently awaiting a communist revolution. And revolution was coming, but not in the way Lenin thought. Back in St. Petersburg, one of the Tsar's most skilled and influential advisors knew the country finally needed to catch up with the rest of Europe. Hey Nick, we really got to industrialize, get more factories, and make some, I don't know, textiles or something. Won't that change the social fabric of Russia? Maybe. Hey, isn't it past your bedtime? But I haven't had my milk and snuggles yet. Will you snuggle me? Nicholas thought modernization was boring, but he let Sergei do his thing. And do his thing he did. He borrowed some money and got Russia some sexy factories. And you know what sexy factories means. Sexy workers. Dirt poor sexy workers. Long hours, low wages, filthy disease-ridden factories. Sleep in overcrowded dormitories with all your stinky worker friends. Get your arms ripped off in a freak Russian doll accident. Conditions were terrible. But this growing working class wasn't about to take it lying down. They started to do what workers do best. Strike. Despite
So he says that like Russia industrialized, and like that is technically true, but like it wasn't anywhere near the level of like what would be required to be like a proper like European superpower, like industrial nation, like all those Western Europe. Russia's economy was still mostly agrarian, still mostly sort of like peasant farming. The farming was like even the agriculture itself wasn't industrialized. There were industrial sort of like factories in the cities and stuff, but like the entire countryside was still very agrarian. No one was still literate. Like it was very limited. And so yes, of course, the industrialization happened, but like he doesn't put it in the context of like why the revolution was so necessary. Like, because he started the video by saying that like, oh, the Western European countries had like industry and like Russia didn't. But like he says it as, oh, you know, the Sergei Witta guy borrowed lots of money and like built factories and like, yeah, but like History is more complicated than that.
Sergei's efforts, people in Russia still weren't happy. Peasants were still poor, liberals still wanted reform, and now the workers wanted better working conditions. And the problem with being an autocrat is that when everyone's unhappy, there's only one person to blame. You. The people hate me. What do I do? Ooh, I know. Why don't we find a weak and pathetic nation to go to war with? We'll win easily, and everyone will love me again. Why don't we just try treating the people better? As luck would have it, an opportunity for war was forming in the Far East. Russia wanted to expand its sphere of influence into northern China, and coincidentally, so did Japan. But Japan didn't really want war, so they proposed an idea to reduce the tension. Hey man, we'll let you do your thing in Manchuria if you let us do our thing in Korea. I don't think so. We've got the largest army in the world. What do you have? I'm the Emperor of Japan. I have a giant mecha suit. Whoa. Cool. Nicholas and the boys didn't see Japan as a threat, so they felt they could push Japan around. But little did they know Japan had been rapidly militarizing, and when they launched a surprise attack on a Russian fleet at Port Arthur, everyone was shocked. Nicholas hoped it was an opportunity to win a quick war and regain the support of the people. Nobody seriously thought a puny Asian country could defeat a European superpower, and the Russian people were filled with patriotic spunk. Hey everyone.
He says the Russian people are filled with patriotic spunk, but that is very sort of, it's an interesting claim because he just spends the entire half of this video talking about how peasants didn't have rights, like people couldn't read, like there was no sense of, like people's lives were just miserable. So he says Russian people feel the patriotic spunk. Like how likely is that like everyone supported this like meaningless war that was just going to divert much needed resources that people already didn't have enough of to soldiers fighting Japan instead of like to the people. Like there's a sort of like when these guys make these types of videos, the internal logic is always like an afterthought. Like the biggest thing is always just like the narrative and the sort of like ideology, but there's comparatively less attention paid to like the internal logic of it. Like, does this make sense for someone to like for someone to watch and follow? Like,
we're at war with Japan. Hey everyone, we're losing the war. The Japanese won.
Yeah, like, it's just such a random LOL Family Guy, like, oh, everyone was happy that they're winning the war and then they started losing, everyone's angry again. It's like, is that really likely, or was everyone just still angry and they never stopped being angry? Like, I don't know. He's trying to sort of like make this more fantastical than it actually was.
Embarrassing defeat for Tsar Nicholas. Russia had enough problems, but now it had been internationally humiliated. The public were outraged. Unrest increased. Nicholas needed snuggles now more than ever. The tension was rising rapidly, and Russia was on the verge of revolution. All it needed was one disaster to push it over the edge, and that disaster would come in January 1905 from an unlikely source, a handsome Orthodox priest named Father Gapon. Father Gapon was leading workers and their families to the Winter Palace, but this wasn't some violent uprising. It was a peaceful protest. They wanted to deliver.
So he says that this is another thing that made me want to respond to this. Like, he says that this dude was just leading a peaceful protest, but in the reality, this dude was a police informant who took the most well-organized and like all of the working class like leaders and
Father
stuff.
Gapon was leading workers and their
All
families.
these people were the most, they weren't just like random peasants. They were the most organized, like radical sort of, like they weren't socialists, but they were the most organized, radical, like a group of workers and like organizers in the area at the time. And that Ukraina that he mentioned, he was literally an informant for them. And the point of this was for them to kill them. Like it wasn't any sort of like peaceful protest. That might have been what he told them, but the reality was that he was leading them to their deaths. And it's literally there that like he was murdered by members of the SRs after he did that, like, because he didn't die on that day. It's funny that like he's leading a peaceful protest and
to the Winter Palace, but this wasn't some violent uprising.
He says he's going to say that the soldiers opened fire on the protest because they did. That's what Bloody Sunday was. But I think it's interesting that like they opened fire on the protesters, but not him. He didn't die on that day. He died later when people found out that he was a police informant. And even Wikipedia still says that Father Gapon is mainly remembered for leading a peaceful protest, and the Imperial Army responded by firing upon the crown. But they didn't fire upon him because he wasn't he wasn't a leader of that movement. He was a sort of he was a traitor to that movement. He wasn't on their side. So of course he doesn't mention
it was a
that
peaceful
because
protest. They wanted to deliver a petition to Nicholas, which simply asked for more freedom and better working conditions. The protest was actually so peaceful and respectful that the Marxists thought it was a big waste of time.
And he says this is a funny thing. He says that the protest was
actually so peaceful and respectful that the Marxists thought it was a big.
He says that the peaceful protest was so peaceful and pleasant and polite that the Marxists thought it was a waste of time. They didn't think it was a waste of time because they were like, they hated peace. They thought it was a waste of time because they knew that the Tsar would not peacefully reduce his authority. the only way that the Tsar would agree to reduce his authority was if he was forced to, because this has been a fact of society like all throughout modern history. Like no ruling class has ever willingly agreed to reduce their power after being peacefully petitioned. They have only ever made concessions when the threat of losing that power was big enough that they had to make concessions. Like the threat of violent uprising and removal is what causes ruling classes to make concessions or step down, not sort of like peaceful demonstrations. Even countries like Hungary, where there was no revolution that led to socialism taking power, was like somewhat democratic. It only happened because Hungary fought a war, sided with the Nazi Germans, and lost that war, and their entire country was basically destroyed. And the occupying Soviets forced them to basically ban all the fascist parties and have elections where fascists couldn't participate. And that was how a bunch of like left-wing parties were able to like take power. Like and when that happened, the Catholic Church in Hungary and all the nobility, they still heavily resisted everything that happened. So the idea that like, oh, Marxists thought the peaceful protest was lame because it was so peaceful, like that's just that's just a very like thought terminating cliche of like to make people stop thinking. Like it's not history. It's just very strange.
Waste of time. Hey, Nicholas, some priest is leading a peaceful protest. Says here they want to give you a petition. A peaceful petitioning priest? I better get out of here. Nicholas had actually left the Winter Palace days earlier, and in his place, they brought in a truckload of troops, ordered to stop Father Gapon from reaching the palace. Hello, good sir, and long live the Tsar. Please, allow me to pass this simple petition to our dear father, Nicholas II. Good day to you too. Please, allow us to respond by opening fire.
And it's funny that like he doesn't even show what happened next because Father Gapon didn't die, but he just like doesn't mention it again. Like it's just very strange. Like, yeah, I don't know.
What began as a peaceful protest ended in tragedy. Imperial soldiers opened fire on the crowd. Around 200 civilians died, 800 more were wounded. All they wanted was the opportunity to ask Nicholas to improve their lives. Instead, they were met with bullets. Nicholas didn't personally order the troops to fire, but as an autocrat...
Yeah, and for the record, that's why the Marxist law was a waste of time, because when you peacefully petition an autocratic czar, he will see it as a threat to his power and he will respond with force. Like that is just like, that's just how they thought, which was why the Marxists believed that any revolution had to be violent and organized, with them as the vanguard, informing them why what they were doing was necessary and the proper steps of how to accomplish it.
He got the blame. The event became known as Bloody Sunday, and Nicholas's reputation plummeted. Strikes erupted across the empire. Workers' demands increased. Liberals demanded political power. Peasants demanded land. The country was out of control, and the 1905 revolution had begun. Listen, Nicholas, peasants seizing my land and murdering my family I can tolerate, but illegally chopping my wood, that's obscene. And the worse I treat my workers, the more they strike. I don't get it. Everyone relax. As long as the military is still on my side, there's nothing to worry about. Sir, the sailors are starting to mutiny. Well, my life just sucks. With Russia still losing to the Japanese, unrest was growing in the military, and some sailors had even taken to killing officers. Having the people against you was bad enough, but if the military joined in, it would be game over. To make matters worse, in October, workers and Marxists, including one Leon Trotsky, began setting up local elected councils called Soviets that coordinated strikes and supplied the workers. Sergei could see the writing on the wall. Things were going south fast, and he needed a big idea to save the Tsar. And luckily, he had just that. You see, all these angry people from different parts of society weren't really working together, meaning there was a weakness to exploit. Sergei wrote a manifesto that would give the liberals an elected assembly called the Duma. It took some convincing, but eventually, Nicholas agreed to share power and have his laws approved by an elected assembly. Hey, liberals, here's your stupid manifesto. Happy now? We certainly are. But what about these guys? Aren't you going to give them what they want? Oh, goodness no. I was just going to kill them. With the liberals...
So he literally admits that the reason why the 1905 revolution failed was because all of society was in disagreement. Well, they weren't working together. It was not an organized, it was a spontaneous uprising, but it was not organized. And it was very easily betrayed by liberals just like selling out everyone else by taking their concessions and just abandoning the revolution, which was why the Tsar did what he did and why, like he says, it didn't work.
Satisfied, and after ending the war with Japan, the Tsar brought thousands of troops home, who then dismantled the Soviets, arrested their leaders, and crushed the peasant uprisings in the countryside. And how about that pesky parliament Nicholas had agreed to share power with? Well, he then wrote a bunch of new laws, which basically said, hey, remember that manifesto I wrote and how you guys were going to approve my laws? Slight change of plan. Actually, I'm going to do whatever the hell I want, and you guys are going to shut up. What? The people won't stand for this. People? What people? You know, this is why people don't like you. And just like that, Nicholas had survived the 1905 revolution. But wait, a revolution? In Russia? Where was Lenin? Well, Lenin and his communist pals were still in exile. He tried desperately to radicalize the uprising, but all he could do was watch. As the movements failed to organize, the liberals sold out the poor, and the Tsar outplayed the people. Furious, he believed Russia had missed a great chance for a real revolution. From now on, he felt the only way left was an armed revolution.
So he kind of like makes this more fantastical, but Lenin from the beginning would have been very in support of violent uprising. Like the reason why the way Lenin actually described the 1905 revolution was the great dress rehearsal. Like the point was that what happened was still useful and they could learn from it so that next time they'd be better prepared to not sort of like accept concessions from the Tsar or half measures. The point of the revolution would be for workers to gain power. Anything less than that would have been a betrayal. Because the whole point of socialism, the whole point of Marxism, the whole point of communism, everything, the whole point of it is for workers to have political control. And anything short of that is betraying the workers. Because at the end of the day, if the landowning classes, if the bourgeoisie, if the rich, if their viewpoints are still the ones being privileged, then nothing has changed. Society hasn't changed. Every bourgeois revolution to overthrow feudalism and install capitalism still betrayed the workers. That's why all of it was pointless. None of it was affecting the real root cause of the issues.
By the workers. Watching the events of 1905 unfold, Lenin learned a lot. The Tsar, however, would prove to have learned nothing. After the 1905 revolution had failed, the Tsar's new top man was Pyotr Stolypin, and he had big ideas to prevent any more chaos. Step 1, reform agriculture. This will make the peasants love you. And step 2, we'll kill anyone who doesn't. To discourage,
It's funny that like he actually acknowledges here at this point
we'll kill anyone.
that the Tsar intended to undermine communism by making peasants to be class traitors. But later on, when he talks about how, I guess, I don't know if you'll talk about this, but when people generally talk about like, oh, the kulaks and Stalin collectivized agriculture was such a bad thing, like at this point you can see even this propagandist is admitting that the rich peasants were supposed to undermine any sort of working class movements by becoming class traitors, and that was like intended to stop revolutionary sentiments among the masses by creating class antagonism within them and by making sure that there would become rich peasants who, because of private farming, would have a reason to oppose any sort of collective or cooperative measures in agriculture. And that's just still so it's just like a LOL thing, but like if someone who was actually interested in like informing people about history would like put that into context and like use it to inform and not just like use it for like family guy jokes.
Who doesn't. To discourage any more revolutionary ideas, Stolypin began to crack down even harder on the Tsar's opponents, and thousands were sentenced to death. The noose even earned itself a new nickname, Stolypin's necktie. I don't get it. Oh, I see, because it goes around my neck. That's so funny. But despite the oppression, many positive reforms were also being made, and the Russian economy even began to improve. This was a problem for
This is something that he says a lot, but it's just factually sort of like misleading because the thing with wars is that war isn't like the default state of society or any economy. War always causes economic downturn because you can't produce, you can't sell stuff, you're at war. Everything, all your economic sort of especially if the war is happening like on your territory or like in your country and stuff, like it obviously causes an economic downturn. Something like the United States in World War II is an exception because the war wasn't being fought on US soil and US industries grew because of the military demands and stuff, and the government's giving them contracts to make bullets and make tanks and stuff and make planes. Obviously, that made the economy grow because again, it was recovering from the Great Depression. So when he says that like, oh, these reforms actually caused the economy to grow, it's misleading because like the war had ended, so the economy was going to grow anyway. It wasn't still like nothing had the people's lives still weren't being improved. Like just because the line is going up doesn't mean that like society still doesn't need like to address the root issues. Like just because the line was down from the war and now it's recovering, it doesn't mean that like the reforms were working or they were positive or there wasn't still reason to protest things.
Lenin. If the people weren't suffering, then they wouldn't support a revolution.
Like this is what he says is like, oh, if the people weren't suffering, he wouldn't support revolution. So it kind of implies that Lenin wanted the people of Russia to be, oppressed and downtrodden so that they would be more sympathetic to communism, which is just it's extremely backwards. Communists were saying that society is already suffering. That is why we need to empower workers and not the class enemies who only benefit themselves by oppressing workers. workers should have the power. That's what this was all about. It wasn't just, oh, people need to suffer so they'll be more sympathetic to communism.
Still in exile and lacking funds, the Bolsheviks simply weren't in a position to do anything. Luckily, it was around this time that Lenin met an incredibly handsome Georgian with your second favorite historical mustache, Joseph Stalin. Lenin and Stalin met at a communist convention in Finland, and Lenin liked Stalin because he was a real go-getter and was great at fundraising for the Bolsheviks. And by fundraising, I mean kidnapping, robbing, extorting, bribing, ransoming, assassinating, prison breaking, stealing, bank raiding, executioning, and stealing again. Hey, Stalin.
And he says all these things to make Stalin seem like a bad guy, but like the context is that Stalin was a member of the Communist Party, and this guy has just already established that like the Tsarist secret police had been cracking down on leftists and other organizers and throwing them in jail and stuff. So Stalin bank robbing imperial banks and prison breaking jailed fellow socialists and dissidents from prison and assassinating imperial collaborators and traitors and things like that. He tries to paint it as like something that's just like bad, that Stalin's a bad guy, but like the historical context was that Stalin was an enemy of the imperials. So if he's doing those things, it's just like these people like we romanticize Star Wars of like, oh, the rebels blew up the fucking Star Wars Death Star, or the rebels went to a Star Wars outpost and blew up all the stormtroopers there. Like that's seen as good, but that's literally what the Bolsheviks are trying to do. And the Mensheviks who split on the party, they didn't approve. I think he's worth mentioning now. They didn't approve of all the bank robbing and extortions and stuff. But like, do you oppose the empire or do you not? That's the reality.
The Mensheviks aren't so hot in all this stealing, but we still need money. So the next time you do a big heist, just do it quietly. Okay, quietly. Got it. If this isn't quiet, I don't know what is. Stalin's wacky antics eventually got him exiled to Siberia, but he'd established himself as a big balls Bolshevik. However, no amount of Bolshevik balls could stop what was happening. The Russian economy was making a recovery. For the Tsar, things were looking up. This is great. All Nicholas has to do is sit back and not mess anything up. Hey everyone, big news. I'd like to introduce you to my new best friend. He's a crazy, drunken, beardy, horny, scandal-ridden man.
So the rest of this video is just he just talks about Rasputin and stuff, and like historians generally disagree on how much influence Rasputin really had on the Tsar, like whether he could actually do all the magic stuff or whatever. It's kind of sort of like Westerners are fascinated with Rasputin because he's so weird and stuff, but like the reality of the economy was that it was going to recover after the war, because that's what economies do after wars. When no one is fighting anymore and you can produce stuff and sell, it's like the economy will generally recover. And the Bolsheviks are still going to continue to try and organize their efforts and like gain more membership and become more popular, because that's what they need to do to gain power. And just accepting these bourgeois reforms wouldn't really solve the root issues. The peasant would still be disenfranchised, literacy would still be low, there would still be sort of there would still be all the problems in society that were there would still be there. So he tries to frame it as this sort of thing of like the Bolsheviks knew that Russia was getting better, so they were annoyed because if Russia wasn't suffering, then they wouldn't gain power. It's just a very like ahistorical viewpoint of like, it's just it's not really informing people. It's just, yeah, I don't know.
Magic wizard man, and he smells like a goat. We're screwed. Rasputin, a dirt poor peasant from dirt poor nowhere. But unlike all the other dirt poor peasants, Rasputin had holy healing powers. And when this holy mystic wandered into St. Petersburg, people began to notice. He quickly became famous, and word of this mystery man and his healing hands made its way to the royal palace. The appearance of a holy homeless healer was of great interest to the Tsar and his wife. As far as royals go, they weren't how the goat got on the roof. Initially, the press were banned from talking about Rasputin, but eventually, the ban was lifted, and the tabloids went to town. The whole thing was a huge scandal, and everyone was freaked out that this guy was influencing the Tsar and his wife. Nicholas could have spent this period of relative peace improving his economy. Things were about to get worse. A lot, and right here. Or maybe better. Maybe Nick would be okay. Economy continued to improve,
so basically
the people's lives kept getting better. Maybe Nick would be okay.
Like the whole point is just that after the war, the economy continues to get better, whatever.
Maybe there would be no more revolutions. Maybe this video could even end
Like
right here.
the Rasputin stuff is just like very, I don't know why he included it. It's just not really relevant to the Russian Revolution. I just want to talk about Rasputin.
Or maybe things were about to get worse. A lot worse. You see, the year is 1914, and that means it's time for World War I.
So in part 2, he starts. This is like
while Nicholas had been busy playing with his new best friend, tensions in Europe had been rising. It just so happened that in 1914, one Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary went for a drive with the top down in Sarajevo. One thing leads to another, and suddenly Russia found itself at war with half of Europe. A wave of patriotism.
So he says he spends 19 seconds explaining why World War I started, and that's just such an insane it's an insane thing to do, because the reason World War I started was because all those countries that he
went for a drive with the top down in Sarajevo.
All these countries.
Thing leads to another, and suddenly Russia found.
All these countries had military alliances with each other. England and France had an alliance. Germany and Austria-Hungary had an alliance. Russia and I think Serbia had an alliance. This is Albania. This is must be Croatia also. But the point is that all of these countries had military alliances, and so the whole point of it was just imperialist sort of infighting, because the reason for wars most times are financial, not anything to do with like one duke dying. That's just like Western sort of like fantasies about like to make these things more sort of like fantastical. All of these empires were rivals because they had divided up the world according to colonies, and they were in search of more markets, more new markets to exploit, because historically the rate of profit tends to fall, and if you're an imperial power, no matter how many colonies you expand to, you will always run into that same problem of sort of like your profit shrinking and generally your market slowing down and your market shrinking rather. So every imperial power always wanted to expand, and this is the main thing that led to wars. All of these colonial powers wanted more colonies, and the way to get colonies was by beating imperial rivals in wars and making them hand over financial control of their colonies to you. That is just the if you read Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Lenin. Lenin talks about this in a book that he wrote while this dude was saying that he was in exile. Uh, all of these, well, not really in exile, but like the point is that capitalism as a whole leads to imperialism, because finance capital emerges because industrial and banking capital merge, and capital begins to be exported, because the way that you can get higher profits is by exporting capital to places where the labor is cheaper. So this is how colonies emerge, because when you export your capital, you go to foreign countries where the industrial proletarian base is not as developed as at home, where labor is cheaper. And what this causes to is the division of the world among capitalist powers. So basically, the whole point is that the war didn't just happen because someone died. Like it was, the world was already in a state of imperial rivalry, and it was that rivalry that led to war breaking out. Because in search of higher profits, like using the military to conquer rivals and forcing them to hand over their colonies was always the best way to achieve that.
Found itself at war with half of Europe.
No,
Away
you just say, oh, it just found itself at war. Like no, there were things that happened that caused rivals to begin actual aggression on their people who were in treaties. So they chose to enter war. It wasn't just like they just found themselves at war. Like it was an active process, because Russia too was an imperial rival, and they also wanted their share of the spoils. It was all connected.
of patriotism swept through Russia. The capital was renamed to Petrograd because St. Petersburg sounded a bit too German. Even revolutionaries were getting on board. To them, World War I was a big stinky imperialist war, but they didn't want their big stinky imperialist replaced by a foreign one.
So this is something interesting that he said that's very revealing. He says that revolutionaries supported the war because even though it was an imperialist war, they didn't want their imperialists to be replaced by a foreign one.
Pretty much everyone wanted Russia to win. I hope Russia loses. Geez, read the room, Lenin. Lenin.
And they frame this as he frames this as sort of bad, of like Lenin wanted Russia to lose the war because that would be the easiest chance of toppling the Tsar and empowering the workers. Why would we support a war where Russia's empire stands to grow bigger? Why would you want them to win so that they would gain more colonies, gain more financial power, gain more prestige and respect among the class enemies, when the defeat would bring about our goals much faster? And he frames that as a bad thing, which is just insane.
Russia would lose because that would help him overthrow the Tsar. As long as he did that, who cares if Germany blows up half?
And he says this so often, where it's like would help him overthrow the Tsar. Like Lenin was like a rival Tsar himself. The point was for the people to overthrow the Tsar. The point was for the working class and peasantry of Russia to overthrow the Tsar. Yes, with the Bolshevik Party as the leading vanguard of that. But he himself just acknowledged in the previous video that the reason why the previous revolution failed was because people weren't organized and didn't have a common goal and didn't have a common political line to follow. Lenin's point, his whole entire reason for existing, was that the Bolshevik Party should be that common goal, so that united the people could overthrow the Tsar and replace it with something that was working in their interest, not the interests of the landowning class or the nobility or the church, their interests. But he just frames it as like, oh, Lenin was just this power hungry guy that just wanted to take control of Russia so he could become an evil dictator and be the king of Russia. Like, it's just very ahistorical.
The country and blow up half the country, they did. An inefficient czarist government meant there were shortages of just about everything you need to fight a war. And if losing a teensy-weensy war with Japan upset the people, losing a giant Wyatt war like this was much worse. Soldiers were deserting, the economy was imploding, and in no time, Russia was starving. The peasants.
And it's so funny that like he says that like, oh, everything was bad, everything was good, people were going great, and then like the Tsar decides to start a war. This is why capitalism is full of contradictions. The war, the peacetime economy was growing, but that slow, steady pace of growth will never supersede the potential of highly exponential growth from growing colonies, exporting capital to new markets. That these will always be the main incentives. They don't make decisions based on like what will benefit people. They make decisions based on what will increase profits, what will enrich them more. This is why our class interests and their class interests don't align.
Were getting more peasanty, the workers were getting more workery, all the while Germany was getting more Germanery. Dmitri, we need to win this war. I need someone with a great military mind to step in and take control. You're right. How about General Hickenlooper? How about me? You can't run the war. Who'll be in charge of the country while you're gone? Obviously, my German wife and a homeless wizard. Duh. Nicholas declared himself commander-in-chief and went to the front lines, leaving his German wife in charge while they were fighting the Germans. It wasn't a good look. And because Alexander was so close to Rasputin, people believed that he was actually calling the shots and secretly destroying Russia, and maybe even boinking her. An even worser look. At this point, a bunch of nobles just couldn't take it anymore. Rasputin is destroying the country. We have to break his magic spell over the Tsar. But how? He's magic. Dude.
So he goes another
cool. Hey, it's Rasputin.
Tangent
The sexy party's
and stuff. I'm like, yeah,
Are
they
you
kill
sure he's dead?
Rasputin.
I don't know,
yeah,
but I'm
it's
supposed to be
fine.
hosting a charity auction right now. Can we get
Historians
this over with?
debate on how important Rasputin actually was to any of this, but like it's just an interesting story to Westerners, so it's just like fascinating for them.
Okay, now he's dead. The murder of Rasputin, just like his life, is shrouded in mystery and speculation. He probably didn't really die like that, but he also probably didn't really heal people. He probably didn't influence the Tsar as much as people thought. He probably wasn't secretly destroying the country. But what he definitely did do, even in his death, was ruin the Tsar's reputation. Russia's autocracy looked more outdated than ever, and the Russian people were taking notice. Come on, men. Remember what we're fighting for. Yeah, no, we're out. World War I left Russia broke, hungry, and exhausted. And with Nicholas acting as commander-in-chief, he was getting even more blame. For the second time, Russia was on the brink of revolution. By 1917, Russia had been fighting a war it couldn't afford for 3 years. They were running out of many things, most worryingly, food. On International Women's Day, 1917, thousands of hungry women in Petrograd were so sick of being hungry that they took to the streets. And it turns out it's not just women who experience hunger, but men too. So the next day they joined in as well. Gatherings on the streets were forbidden, but I'm not sure how you'd arrest 250,000 people. The crowds demanded an end to the war, an end to food rationing, and even an end to the Tsar's autocracy. Now normally the troops would deal with this kind of thing, but as it turns out, soldiers get hungry too. And they were also tired of having to kill their fellow Russians so much. So entire regiments mutinied in the capital, and they joined the crowd as well, trashing symbols of the Tsar and his autocratic regime. Things were escalating very quickly. Liberal politicians watching the riots in the streets had long been dissatisfied with the Tsar, since he would shut their parliament down anytime they did something he didn't like. They believed the only way to bring stability back to the streets was for Nicholas II to abdicate. The riots continued. The police fired on soldiers. Soldiers fired on soldiers. The workers re-established the Petrograd Soviet. Politicians began arresting the Tsar's ministers. He may have been an autocrat, but he just lost complete control of his capital city. Talk about embarrassing. Nicholas, the troops have turned against us. The people have taken over the city. They've even cut my phone line. Hello? Hello? The phones are down. Things must be bad. I'd better go back there. Nicholas hopped on the next train back to Petrograd, but he never made it to the city. His train was met by military generals and other politicians. What's going on? Nicholas, look man, we need to talk. It's not you, it's us. Ah, who am I kidding? No, it's definitely you. During the whole crisis in Petrograd, the liberals convinced the generals that if Nicholas abdicated, the people would calm down, and the generals were on board. They didn't have time to quell the chaos, because don't forget, they were still losing a global, all-encompassing war against the Germans. And with the military no longer on his side, Nicholas had no choice but to step down. Throughout his entire reign, he had done everything he could to keep all the power for himself, and in the end, that's exactly what left him with none. But then there was a big question. Who would replace Nicholas? Well, his son Alexei was next in line. Hey buddy, Daddy couldn't handle the complex socioeconomic problems of a giant multinational, multi-ethnic empire that's engaged in total war with all of Europe. You think you could give it a shot? Alexei just wasn't ready to be Tsar. Nicholas did have a brother, but given the state of the empire, he wasn't keen either. And so, 300 years of Romanov rule in Russia just kind of came to an end. The earlier 1905 revolution hadn't changed much, but this new revolution had left Russia without a Tsar. And still, before the year was over, there would be one more revolution left to come. Nicholas's failure as commander of the armed forces was the
Lenin's revolution of communist utopia. This is just such a strange framing. Like no one thought that would be utopia, but the point was that let the people make the decisions, not the Tsar and the nobility. And yeah, it's so strange.
Straw that broke the camel's back. Do you think maybe you could have done any better? Well, guess what? It's time to find out in Rise of Kingdoms. Rise of Kingdoms is an epic, massive multiplayer, free-to-play, real-time strategy game. Now, where was I? Oh yeah, hungry woman, absolute chaos, and the end of the Tsar. Oh, hey guys, says here there's been a revolution, and the reign of the Tsars has ended. Oh, come on, I missed another one? Why am I even in this video? Well, it's not like you could have done anything. As long as there's a world war, you can't get back to Russia. Who wants to start a revolution? Dang it! Despite getting rid of Nick, Russia was still at war with half of Europe. The Germans, however, had an idea. They thought that if they helped Lenin get back, he'd cause trouble for the new Russian government. So they put him on a train. Destination, Petrograd. It was a long journey, and while Lenin was cooped up in his train, things in Russia were changing. Workers were taking control of their factories. Soldiers were socking it to their mean old officers. Without a czar, a big old power vacuum had opened up, and someone needed to fill it. The liberals proposed they be in charge, and they set up the provisional government. The workers, however, had already begun establishing local Soviets, largely controlled by the social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks. And since neither felt like they had the power to oust the other, Russia ended up in a classic dual power conundrum. The two coexisted, with the provisional government becoming the official government, and the elected Soviets issuing orders to the workers and soldiers.
So this is something that is very important to the context of the Russian Revolution, because just because the provisional government was sort of like certified and authorized by like the official transfer of power, it doesn't mean that they actually control stuff. Like the Soviets still had the main like influence of the workers, and most of the peasant base didn't really have faith in the sort of Duma to preserve their interest. So they were way more likely to align with the Soviets if the Soviets had the leadership that would sort of advocate for the peasants. That was the whole idea.
Power balance was delicate, and all it would take is one bold revolutionary to come along and give everyone a big-brained beatdown. Oh boy, Lenin's coming home. I can't wait for him to see all the great things we've accomplished, and I'm going to show him my fan art. Oh look, here he comes now. Shut up! You all.
And he frames this sort of thing as like, oh, Lenin was. It's like the sort of the paradox of all this propaganda is like he has to acknowledge that Lenin was still widely popular, like there were crowds that were excited for him to come back to Russia. But then he starts to frame it as like, oh, Lenin actually hated all of them, like you all suck, blah blah blah.
Suck! The provisional government sucks, the Soviet sucks, even your fan art sucks.
And the reason he said that the Soviets currently suck was because the Menshevik and social revolutionary leadership was not advocating for the peasants. Because this is the thing where like the SRs and like there are lots of other channels I've talked about this in the past. But like the thing with the SRs was that they sort of had a very sort of a utopian view of socialism. They saw themselves as like the heroes of the revolution that would sort of like lead the people sort of like valiantly, and they didn't really like the peasants. They thought that the peasants didn't have revolutionary potentials. They were they were from the same like coaching tree, the same like ancestry as the Narodniks, who are the same sort of people where like they saw themselves as like heroes, and they didn't really believe that like a mass movement could effectively like have a revolution, but like they would be the sort of like heroes who would like lead the people. And Lenin disagreed with this. Lenin wanted the communists to be the party of the mass workers and peasants movement as a whole, not just a sort of like a heroic pantheon of gods who would do all the revolutionary work on behalf of the people. So that's why he thought that Soviets were stupid, because as this video just ignores, the Soviets were being led by the Mensheviks, who were again the same thing of like not very radical and overly willing to concede. And remember, at this point, Trotsky was a Menshevik. Trotsky didn't join the Bolsheviks until much later. He was a Menshevik by this point. The Bolsheviks were Lenin, Stalin, Kalinin, Kollontai, Elena Stasova, all those guys. They were not the people in the Mensheviks now were not Lenin's friends. So Lenin had his people that he trusted to run stuff, and they were not people in power now. That's why he said that Soviets were dumb. And obviously he said that provisional government was dumb because provisional government was still like primarily in the interest of the landowning classes and the bourgeois military generals and the like, not the workers and peasants. That's why he said everybody was dumb, because no one was working in the interest of the workers and peasants except the Bolsheviks.
Why does he have to be so mean? In case you couldn't tell, Lenin wasn't a fan of everything that had been happening. In his April theses, he called the provisional government and the Soviets a bunch of big bourgeois bozos. And he kind of had a point. There was still a lot for the Russian people to be mad about. The provisional government hadn't got Russia out of the war, the people were still hungry, and the peasants were still hoping to get more land. Meanwhile, the Soviets hadn't done much to change things either. But even though they weren't perfect, a lot of people did like what the new government had been doing.
He says that even though they weren't perfect, a lot of people did like his, but it's like not the workers and peasants. So who is this a lot of people? Clearly he means the bourgeois landowning classes who are ready to, just like every bourgeois revolution, still sort of like ride the coattails, because even the sort of like Mensheviks, their whole thing was that they didn't believe that you could go straight to a proletarian revolution from feudalism. They thought that they had to do a bourgeois revolution first and introduce capitalism and allow capitalism to fully develop and industrialize the country. Then they could have a socialist revolution against capitalism. Lenin and all the other Bolsheviks wanted to directly overthrow the feudal aristocracy and monarchy and industrialize Russia under socialism, which nobody thought was possible. And even Lenin himself wasn't fully in. There was no clear sort of like clear defined ideas from Lenin on how this would be done. It was mostly Stalin that had to do that work, and that was why the all of the industrialization that happened under the USSR was under Stalin, because they had to make it up as they went along. There was no sort of like rule book that they would follow to do it. It was a process of learning and a process of iteration. That's why, again, it wasn't utopian, because utopian socialism would have been just idealist, just letting whatever happens happens. It was scientific, it was materialist, it was a process that they had to iterate on over and over and over. They had to plan it, and it was deliberate.
Was progress. The secret police were disbanded, the death penalty abolished. They even planned to hold elections, meaning for the first time ever, the Russian people could choose their own government. To many.
And it's interesting that he says they even plan to hold elections, because he just spent this entire video talking about how where was it? He spent the entire last video talking about how the workers had established Soviets, which were workers' councils, which were democratically elected, and those workers' councils had equal power to the provisional government. So you can see the contradiction of this propaganda, where it's like, oh, the Russian people had never had elections, they never had democratic bourgeois elections, but at the same time, they had an organ of power that actually represented them, the Soviets, that they could have a say in. They could have a say in the bourgeois politics, but they could have a say in the proletarian politics. But the Western mind struggles to understand these things. So he sees it as like the people would celebrate having free and fair elections for the first time, where like all the candidates, it would be like in America, all the candidates would be sort of like bourgeois candidates that were bought by all the richest interested parties, and anything that would be done would never oppose those interests because you would be removed, you would lose your authority. Is free and fair elections better, or is an organ of power that actually exists for you, made up of people like you that will always advocate for your interests, who have complete and total control of society, or still remaining at the mercy of these bourgeois elements? Like, it's not really a choice, but that's the ideology says that he has to sort of like portray these free and fair elections as like something good.
Lenin seemed like some out-of-touch weirdo. If Lenin wanted to go from whiny irrelevant zero to hunky communist hero, he'd need to shake things up a bit. So he and the Bolsheviks came up with a hot new slogan that promised to give the people what the provisional government wouldn't. Peace. Don't like war? We'll end it. Land. You want land? We'll give it to you. Bread. Hungry. Scooby-Dooby-Doo.
And he says this as like, again, you can see that like the Bolsheviks were the only people with like an actual plan for like how society can progress, because the provisional government didn't end the war. Why didn't they end the war? Because of all those things I talked about, of the need for the imperialist sort of like rivalry to continue, because they knew that like the wealthy and the landowning classes were invested in Russia continuing the war, because that was how their profits would increase, by Russia conquering their colonial rivals and gaining a share of the spoils. Wanting to end the war would have meant territorial concessions to Germany, the loss of international prestige, and also valuable land and industry in those areas that Germany was going to conquer. But the Bolsheviks didn't care. The Bolsheviks just wanted peace, because that was the only way that they could actually start building socialism. Because just because the Bolshevik party was in control of Russia, it didn't, first of all, it didn't even mean that they controlled all of Russia's territory. And the second, it didn't mean that Russia was communist. It just meant that Bolshevik party was in control. And it just meant that the workers and peasants' interests would be privileged above the interests of the Orthodox Church or the landowning classes or the nobility. That's what it meant.
Lenin also called for all power to the Soviets, which meant...
You see, he just said it here. All power to the Soviets. What does that mean? All power to the Soviets meant that the Soviets should be the people calling the shots, not the provisional government, because the Soviets represented the interests, or they were supposed to represent the interests of the workers and peasants. The Duma, the parliaments, didn't represent the interests of the workers and peasants. They represented the interests of the wealthy landowning classes and the nobility. That was why they liked that the economy was improving. That was why they liked that the war was continuing. They were invested in all those things, but the Soviets weren't, because the Soviets represented people who wanted peace, land, and bread, just like Lenin said.
all power to the Soviets, which meant getting rid of the provisional government and having the Soviets run the place. A communist dream. The people liked
He says it again, the communist dream. It's like, this is just silly. I don't know.
these slogans, and bit by bit, the Bolsheviks became more popular. Some mentioned
The people like these slogans, and the Bolsheviks became more popular. It's like, yes, of course, because the Bolsheviks were advocating for them. That's what happens when you advocate for people. They like you.
even began switching sides, but
He acknowledges now that Trotsky, only now at this point did Trotsky finally switch sides. And Stalin has been a Bolshevik from day one, basically. But Trotsky became a Bolshevik only now. That's why it's so funny also the propaganda of like, he's going to say it later, but like the propaganda of like how Trotsky was more popular than Stalin and he was closer to Lenin, he was more of a friend to Lenin than Stalin. Like, it's all Trotsky's propaganda and like imperialist propaganda, anti-communist propaganda, because like we can see at this point that Trotsky has not been party to all of these conversations and all of these like the workers and peasants sort of like advocacy that has been going on. Trotsky was with the Mensheviks, and Lenin criticized Trotsky greatly for this. Lenin always said about Trotsky that like the only thing he's good at is switching sides. Like, he doesn't have any clearly defined vision of his own. He doesn't have any political ideas of his own. He just switches sides. Like, this is like known among historians. Even anti-communist historians acknowledge this.
even though the people thought Lenin's slogans rocked, as long as the provisional government didn't mess up, they'd continue to support it. So let's check in on the provisional government. Oh, provisional government, you've made a big mess. The provisional government lasted for just 9 months, but those 9 months were chaos. The people wanted Russia out of World War I, but Minister of War Alexander Kerensky thought instead of doing that, why not do the exact opposite? If the people saw more Russian victories, they'd have to support the new government. And that
like this is how he says it as like this, but it's not necessarily like this is just the logic of not empowering workers and peasants. If you're doing things in the interest of the landowning classes, you will do things like this, where you want to continue the war because you need to continue conquering the imperial territories and you want to defeat your imperial rivals so you can gain your share of the spoils. That was why Lenin opposed this. That was why the Bolsheviks did not want the war to continue.
went just about as well as you might expect. These heavy defeats worsened the Russian economy and made the hungry people hungrier. And by now, I think you know what comes next. They trashed the place. More looting, more rioting, more violence. It was like the Tsar had never abdicated. Tens of thousands of armed workers took to the streets during some of the worst violence Petrograd had seen yet. And in response, Kerensky called in the troops, who opened fire on the demonstrators.
So the July days that he talks about here, technically what he says is a little bit true, but it's not really the point was that the point was that it was just an excuse to crack down on the Bolsheviks. Like the main thing was that Bolshevik power had been growing and they wanted to stamp down on that. All the other events were just like it was a matter of fact, but the fact of the matter was that they wanted to crack down on Bolshevik power because Bolshevik power was growing.
For now, Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders wanted to distance themselves from the violence, but the crowds
and the thing is that it was spontaneous, and Lenin, it wasn't organized by the Bolsheviks, but he will acknowledge that they still used it as an excuse to crack down on Bolshevik power, even though Lenin and the Bolsheviks themselves didn't organize the protests. The protests were still used as a cudgel to undermine them.
marched under Bolshevik slogans, and as a result, Kerensky, now the prime minister, took the opportunity to stamp down on the Bolsheviks. Their leaders were arrested.
Yeah, he just took the opportunity. Like, why did he do that? Because the Bolsheviks were getting more popular. Even you can see, even the provisional government is betraying the revolution by arresting the Bolshevik leaders that are growing more power. He says he acknowledges that people were using.
Took the opportunity to stamp down on the Bolsheviks. The result, Kerensky
he acknowledges that people were using.
Distance themselves from the violence, but the crowds marched under Bolshevik slogans.
People were using Bolshevik slogans. Why did they do that? Because Bolsheviks were popular. Because Bolsheviks had the workers and peasants' interests aligned. Like they were the people who were actually the only political entity that was advocating for the workers and peasants. It wasn't just like a random thing. It didn't just like happen.
And as a result, Kerensky, now the prime minister, took the opportunity to stamp down on the Bolsheviks. Their leaders were arrested. Lenin was accused of being a German agent, and he was forced to flee to Finland in disguise. This sucks! Now I'll never get to have my revolution.
Yeah, so he just does like casual transphobia of like Lenin living in disguise. Like, it's not really necessary to indulge in all that. I don't know.
Traditional liberals and bougie business boys.
But the point was that, yes, the February Revolution had betrayed the actual workers and peasants because they arrested Bolshevik leaders and forced Lenin to flee again. He had to leave Russia again, even though he just came back to Russia. Lenin was forced to flee again, and basically they were back to square one. You can see again that the provisional government is still, who are these people?
To appease them, Kerensky decided to promote
He's appeasing the liberals and the wealthy capitalists. He's not talking to workers and peasants. This is who he's still talking to.
Military legend to supreme commander of the armed forces, someone who hated the revolution, loved the death penalty, and was devoutly anti-socialist, General Kornilov. Hey man, thanks for the promotion. That was real swell of you. Of course, with you by my side, who would dare try to overthrow me? How about me? I did not see this coming. Unfortunately for Kerensky, Kornilov hated the liberal and socialist reforms of the new government, particularly the dumb socialist soldiers' committees. The army was no place for undisciplined left-wing snowflakes. Fearing a Bolshevik takeover was imminent, Kornilov ordered his men towards Petrograd to oust the Soviet and take over. Kerensky freaked out, and he needed help. Since he knew Trotsky was finger-licking good at organizing, he and other Bolshevik leaders were released, and they, along with the Soviet, organized the defense of Petrograd. Kornilov had the power of soldiers, but the Soviet had the power of workers, and they did what...
So it's interesting that he acknowledges once again that the provisional government had betrayed the revolution, but to defend that revolution, they had to free the Bolsheviks. It's like the Bolsheviks were the only party that had the interest in revolution in their heads. They were not trying to betray it. And when it was under threat, the most effective defense was the Bolsheviks.
Workers do best. Railroad workers diverted Kornilov's men away. Telegraph workers messed with his communications. They even infiltrated his forces and encouraged the demoralized men to desert. They were also armed en masse, but in the end, no fighting was necessary because Kornilov's coup just fell apart, and Kornilov was sent straight to prison.
And so it's interesting. He actually acknowledges all of this. You know, he spent the first part of the video and the first video saying, "Oh, Lenin was this this king figure who had aspirations," but like he has just described ordinary workers and peasants doing things that protected their revolution. Not Lenin. Lenin didn't direct these people to do it. He did it. Yeah, Trotsky organized the soldiers and stuff, and Trotsky would be the person who would eventually create the Red Army. But like, it wasn't just Lenin being a king or ordering these people to do this. Lenin was in Finland by this point. So like, yeah, the dissonance of anti-communist propaganda is really powerful. If you just like watch it critically, you really just wonder like, how do these people not like ask themselves questions when they watch these things?
Everything was coming up Kerensky. Hey, thanks for the help, boys. Couldn't have done it without you. Now that there's no longer any threat, how about you, return all those guns I gave you? No. Oh, no. In order to kill a rat, Kerensky had just given a gun to a bear, a Bolshevik bear. The whole affair was a huge propaganda win for them. They had defended the revolution, and their popularity skyrocketed.
So it's funny that like Bolsheviks were originally not popular, but their popularity had been growing, and Kerensky took steps to try and slow their popularity by jailing all their leaders and putting an anti-communist general in charge of the armed forces. And that guy responded by trying to upend the entire thing. And the only people who could effectively defend the revolution were Bolsheviks. So like, it's not magic that they became so popular. And it's like,
they found themselves elected to the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets.
Yeah, so of course all the Bolsheviks took power in the Soviets, and it was only natural that by that point the only thing remaining would be to actually implement the proletarian revolution that they had wanted from the beginning since 1905. But everyone called them lunatics and madmen and crazy and weirdos, and Lenin was a patriotic he wasn't patriotic enough for not wanting Russia to lose the war, when everything that they were saying is what happened, and they eventually ended up getting mass support, which was their vision.
Trotsky even becoming chairman in Petrograd. They were now in a very powerful position, almost powerful enough for Lenin to return home from Finland and finally stage his long-awaited communist revolution. The Bolsheviks began planning their takeover of the Russian government. Some got cold feet and began arguing against...
So you can see here, Zinoviev and Kamenev, even at this point, they are still not willing to go all the way towards like what's necessary. But notice who isn't here. Stalin isn't here, because Stalin from day one was always in step with Lenin. He was always the closest sort of person to Lenin's vision for what was supposed to happen. All of these people, the reason why if you look them up on Wikipedia, you see that they died in like 1936, was because all these people, including Trotsky, were so disappointed and angry with Stalin taking power in the USSR that they plotted to create a fifth column in the USSR and depose Stalin, collaborated with the Nazis even to do this. They were planning to, in World War II, support the Nazi German invasion of the Soviet Union, depose Stalin from power, give territorial concessions to the Nazi Germans so that they could then finally have their vision of what socialism was supposed to look like. That wasn't in line with Lenin's vision, but was in line with their sort of revisionist, not really revisionist, but like concessionary framework for what socialism was supposed to look like, because they were scared of actual proletarian revolution. Only Stalin wasn't.
Lenin's armed revolution in favor of a more peaceful approach, and they even wrote newspaper articles about it, which kind of gave the whole scheme away. The Bolsheviks are planning an armed revolution?
Yeah, like they literally, even until the very end, they were still willing to do things that could betray the revolution. Look how many times the revolution has been betrayed by this point. Almost 3 times, and they were still doing things like that. That's why, yeah, I don't like when you look at the Great Purge and you hear all these like, oh, all these old Bolsheviks, Kamenev, Zinoviev, Trotsky, like these people were not old Bolsheviks. The old Bolsheviks were Lenin, Stalin, Kalinin, Lazar, Kaganovich, Elena Sasova, Alexander Kollontai, people that were Bolsheviks from day one, that never, they had their flaws, they had their sort of tendencies that occasionally caused them to be led astray, but they never betrayed, never betrayed Bolshevik agenda. It was people like these guys who joined Bolsheviks very late that were constantly doing things like this, especially Trotsky.
I did not see this coming. Kerensky began arresting Bolsheviks, and as a result, Lenin and the boys felt they had no choice but to commence the revolution.
And once again, you see Kerensky already again started arresting Bolsheviks, and that was why they felt that they had to do the revolution now. They couldn't wait. They had to act now.
Right now. Lenin was back in Petrograd, but was still in hiding, so Trotsky got the ball rolling, using his position as Soviet chairman to organize the Bolshevik militias. Now, if you were to ask Soviet artists, the revolution went something like this. As much as they would like you to think it was a glorious, violent, heroic takeover, the truth seems to be a little more underwhelming. The Bolsheviks just kind of walked into key buildings in the city and took control. Bolshevik supporting sailors even brought in a huge battleship, but there wasn't really any fighting. Nobody really tried to stop them. In just one day, they took control of the city.
Yeah, and he frames that as some sort of like, it's so weird that nobody tried to support them. Like, of course nobody tried to support them because Bolsheviks were insanely, massively popular. Everybody in the Petrograd Soviets had elected the Bolsheviks to power. The Bolsheviks were the party that had mass supports, that had a base. All these other people didn't have a base. They were just acting in the interests of sort of like moneyed classes. But only the Bolsheviks had an actual base. If you look at Red Guards, like these were armed factory workers who called for the protection of the Soviet power. They wanted they wanted the Soviets to not lose power. They wanted to protect the Soviets' power. It's like he's committed to framing this as some sort of fantastical thing of like, oh, it's so underwhelming and stuff. It's like, no, they had support. I don't know what the point is supposed to be.
Next, Kerensky just managed to escape before the Bolsheviks surrendered the Winter Palace, placing
Why did Kerensky escape? if it was so underwhelming and like the Bolsheviks surrounded the Winter Palace and stuff. It was like, yeah.
The provisional government under siege inside. Is it safe to come out yet? I think so. Fear my revolutionary.
And the thing he says that Lenin is in hiding as some sort of coward, but like the reason why Lenin was in hiding was because he was seen as a threat. He was seen like by this point the provisional government had initiated a crackdown on the Bolsheviks, and they had raided Pravda, which was the Communist Party's newspaper, which Stalin had been made the editor of by Lenin. And Stalin smuggled Lenin out of the newspaper's office and took charge of the safety. And eventually he took him to a railway station and stuff. But the point is that Lenin was just in hiding because he was a coward. Lenin was in hiding was because people actually wanted to get rid of him. People had tried to. They saw him as a figurehead of this movement, and it was in their interest to remove him from power. And that's Wikipedia. It's not like Wikipedia is some communist source. Like it's Wikipedia. Like this is just facts. It's not anything.
Very might. Give me that. That night, Lenin came out of hiding to play a bigger role in the revolution. With him back at the helm, they had one more job to do: storm the Winter Palace and arrest the provisional government. And here comes the final showdown. The palace was defended by a force known as the Battalion of Death, who immediately gave up. And just like that, Lenin had won. As far as violent, bloody revolutionary uprisings go, this wasn't really one of them. But
and it's strange. He frames it as some sort of like thing of like, oh, it wasn't even that bloody, it wasn't even that violent. But like, of course it wasn't, because there was no need, because they had mass support. And the thing is that Lenin was still the leader of the movement, so of course he took a prominent role in the revolution, because he was the person who had given a voice and organized the sort of the mass movement. He was the figurehead of that. So he says it as like this thing of like like of just, oh, he just walked in and took credit for everything. It's like, no, the 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 point was that he was their leader, and like leaders are chosen by the people, and he was the guy that was in charge, like not necessarily in charge of like they're following his orders, but like he was their leader. Like it sounds so strange to explain it, but like it's I don't know what else you're supposed to say to this. Like, yes.
Lenin was finally in charge of Russia. He had spent his whole life dreaming of this moment.
And he said again, Lenin was finally in charge of Russia. He was not technically in charge of Russia. He was in charge of the Bolshevik party because he was leader of the party. Parties have leaders. The actual de facto state of Russia was that the entities that were in charge of Russia were the Soviets. That was why the whole point was like all part of the Soviets. I don't understand how this guy just spent the entire video talking about all part of the Soviets, and I was saying Lenin was in charge of Russia. He wasn't in charge of Russia.
He set up the first Council of People's Commissars.
He says it, he acknowledged it a second later. The Council of People's Commissars. What was the Council of People's Commissars? The Council of People's Commissars was like all the ministries, like obviously the People's Commissariats were just ministries. So like the People's Commissariats for Labor, People's Commissariats for the Interior, People's Commissariats for like it was just like the sort of it's almost think of it as like the legislature. Like the Council of People's Commissars was just the government. And Lenin was just, yes, the government was run by the Bolshevik party, of course, and Lenin was the leader of that party. But again, the fundamental ruling sort of like status quo was that the Soviets were in power, not Lenin. Lenin was a king. He was just one council member, and he was chairman of the council, sure, but he didn't have absolute power to just rule Russia as he saw fit. The point was for the Soviets to have power so that the Soviets could be governed along the lines of Marxism and set about implementing socialism nationwide. Socialism meaning worker control. So it's just like it's not there's just so much a history. There's just so much like propaganda and all of this. Like it's just very strange.
His own cabinet with him in charge. This was it. His
Yeah,
chance.
it's like with him in charge, but he was leader of the party. Of course, he was in charge. Like he was appointed to be in charge because he was appointed as the leader of the party.
To finally make his communist utopia with equality and freedoms.
It says again the communist utopia, and I already explained earlier in the video of like why nobody actually believed that there would be utopia. In fact, the first thing Lenin did as the leader of the communist utopia was immediately implement war communism, because the first thing the Allies did when they found out that the Bolsheviks had won was immediately invade Soviet Russia and try to forcefully remove this revolutionary government that had the support of the workers and peasants. And so it wasn't a utopia, it was still a backwards agrarian peasant country that had just suffered through World War One, 3 years of World War One, and people were starving. Everything was sort of like it was the furthest thing possible from a utopia. The first thing that they did was organize the Red Army to defend the Bolshevik Revolution from the whites and start requisitioning grain. This was what was called war communism. And war communism, it sounds like spooky and scary, but war communism was just forced grain requisition, and it was just basically just it was just like the Red Army controlling the authority in all the Soviet regions. So like all the industries were nationalized. There was like strict discipline for workers. There was like requisitioning of grain, and there was like strict military rationing, wartime rationing, and obviously private industry was banned. That was just what war communism was. And again, this isn't a utopia. None of this is communism. This stuff is this is not what communism means. This was a reaction to the Russian Civil War, which was an effort by the Allies to overthrow the Bolshevik Party. So this isn't a utopia. This was circumstances that were forced on them by external factors.
Beyond compare. Hey Lenin, before we took power, they were planning on holding elections. Shall we go ahead with those? Of course. You can't have a communist utopia without high levels of political participation.
And what he meant by this was that you can't have communist power without Soviets. The proletariat should be free to elect their representatives to the Soviets.
What? The social revolution.
This is so dishonest because
we lost.
He's talking about the bourgeois elections. He had already acknowledged that the people had voted in the Bolsheviks to power in the Soviets, not to the Duma. The Bolsheviks didn't want the Duma. And he talked about this earlier in the video too. This guy is just so insane. He's saying that Lenin, oh, those don't count. Of course, because they wanted all parts of the Soviets. The Bolsheviks had power in the Soviets. It didn't matter what the bourgeois elections, what party won there, because the parliament didn't have power.
Don't count. Lenin claimed the elections were unfair, and the constitution.
You see, it's like the Russian constituency, the Russian constituent assembly election in 1917. Of course, it was not going to be Bolshevik held because the Bolsheviks had power in the Soviets. So this is just such a strange sort of like yeah, I know he tries to, yeah, I don't, it's just very like he tries to spin it as like Lenin was opposed to democracy and he's spooky and he wanted control of everything. It was a spooky deal, but like he just spent 16 minutes of this video explaining how Lenin wanted to undermine the parliament. He wanted all power in the Soviets. The Soviets. He just set up a council of people's commissars. What would he care about the Constituent Assembly elections for?
An assembly they created was counter-revolutionary. He presented the new.
He said that it was counter-revolutionary because revolutionary power was in the Soviets. This is so strange.
Assembly with a motion that basically said, sign here and give up your power. And
he told them to give up their power because they were no longer legitimate. They didn't have legitimacy. They had been losing their legitimacy basically since World War I started because they didn't leave the war. The only party committed to ending the war was Bolshevik Party, and now Bolshevik Party was in the hands of the Soviets, not the Constituent Assembly, not the Duma. That was why he told them to sign and give up their power. And of course, Bolsheviks ran in the Constituent Assembly because it was necessary at the time when it became clear that the 1905 revolution had failed. They had decided that they were going to participate in parliamentary elections because that was the place where the masses were. Lenin's whole point was always that the Bolsheviks need to be where the masses are. They need to be in step with the masses. If the masses are revolting, then the Bolsheviks need to be there, guiding them, being a vanguard. But if the masses have decided that the revolution has failed and they're not going to turn their attention to the parliament, then Bolsheviks need to be where the parliament is and spreading Bolshevik ideas about why the parliament was counter-revolutionary and why they weren't interested in stopping the war and why they were still mainly interested in the moneyed classes, not the workers and peasants. All of this was necessary. But of course, most people participating in elections, because remember at this point, it's not as if Russia had universal suffrage. Universal suffrage would come with the Soviet Union, with the Bolsheviks, not at this point. At this point, these are still bourgeois elections where the only people that can participate are the moneyed and landowning classes that were allowed to vote. This video did not mention anything about universal suffrage coming with the 1917 revolution. I could be wrong, but I'll see Russian Constituent Assembly election. Like, yeah, so these were organized as a result of events in the February Revolution. So this had basically none of the this had none of the context for everything that happened since February. They were elected by the Russian provisional government, and of course the Bolsheviks participated in it, and Lenin was their leader, and Lenin would have been a member of the Russian Constituent Assembly. But we just established that the whole point of everything that they had done was to remove power from the Russian Constituent Assembly. The whole point was for the Bolsheviks to establish dual power with the Soviets until the Soviets took legitimacy from the Duma and the Duma was obsolete. And they had succeeded. That was why Lenin told them to give up their power, because the Soviets had won. The Soviets were the legitimate power.
the assembly was like, no. Lenin said, see, they're disobeying me. Proof they're counter-revolutionary.
And he says like, oh, they're disobeying me. It's such a strange thing. Like, they were not disobeying Lenin. They were disobeying the will of the people. The will of the people was, he just acknowledged in a previous part of the video, people were marching under Soviet slogans, peace, land, and bread, all parts of the Soviets. And then the provisional government was saying that they were not going to give up power to the Soviets. Of course, they were counter-revolutionary. Like, what? Lenin is just making these things up. Like, this is the reality. Like, does he even understand what he's saying?
Shut it down, boys. Moderate socialists and others weren't happy when Lenin had the assembly closed by force, and when
Of course, they weren't happy because they were betrayers of the revolution. Moderate socialists and reformers didn't agree with everything Bolsheviks were doing. They didn't believe that the workers and peasants could hold political power. They didn't believe that the war should end. Of course, they didn't like it, but they didn't like it because they were not the majority. The majority were the workers and peasants who wanted the war to end, who wanted all power to the Soviets. That was the whole point of all of this. This is just such a misrepresentation, and it's just like such a strange like twisting of reality to make it seem like Lenin was just this like out of touch weirdo dictator who just wanted to rule Russia at all costs. He's totally ignoring the historical context of everything that was happening.
campaigners began taking to the streets, they were fired upon. For Lenin, setting up a communist utopia was looking suspiciously.
And of course, they were fired upon because those people were counter-revolutionary. Again, we just established that the Red Guards, where were they? The Red Guards were paramilitary volunteer formations consisting of factory workers, peasants, and Cossacks, of soldiers and sailors for the protection of the Soviet power. Those people are invested in protecting Soviet power. This is a Vulcan factory in, I think it looks like it's in Soviet Ukraine or in the Ukrainian SSR, which also existed in parallel to all of this. But like these are Red Guards who were invested in Soviet power being maintained. It wasn't the Tsarist Russian army.
Force, and when campaigners began taking to the streets, they're
fired upon by workers and peasants of the Red Guards who are interested in protecting Soviet power. These people are not workers and peasants. These are bourgeois reformists who are interested in preserving the monopoly capitalists and liberal reformers' power. This is very basic class antagonism. It's not something of like, oh, you hated when the Imperial Russian Tsarist military fired on peaceful protests, but now you're firing
had the assembly closed by force, and when campaigners began taking
campaigners in favor of counter-revolutionary things. Of course, because we're not babies, we can understand these things, that it depends on whose actions are being criticized and whose actions are being advocated for. If you're advocating for counter-revolutionary things, then revolutionary people will oppose you. If you're advocating for revolutionary things, then counter-revolutionary people will oppose you. That's just how life works. It wasn't anything it wasn't anything strange. It wasn't anything like confusing. This is just very basic.
The streets, they were fired upon. For Lenin, setting up a communist utopia was looking suspiciously like setting up a dictatorship. While he was
it's just like, he's setting up a dictatorship of the Soviets, the protection of the Soviets' power. It was a dictatorship, yes, but not of Lenin. Lenin didn't want to be the one dictating what would happen. The point was for the Soviets to have power. That was the whole point. That was why it was in the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, because it was the Soviets that had power, not anybody else. So yes, it was a dictatorship, but it was a dictatorship of the Soviets, not of Lenin. Lenin was not interested in being a dictator. He wanted the working people, the proletariat and the peasants, to be the dictators. They would be the ones who called the shots, not him.
Was implementing many of the communist policies you'd expect.
And of course, he acknowledges that workers' rights would be improved, of course, redistribution of land, this would all happen. There's lots of writings by if we can see here, there's literally there's lots of writing on this, but like one of the most popular and new accommodations that Russian workers now enjoyed was the ability to take a near unlimited number of paid sick days and respite away from work, because the new revolutionary healthcare system was controlled by the workers, patients, and local Soviets. Because the health system was free, universal, and moved from the dictate of market profitability and finance capital, it became easy for a worker suffering from injury or ill health to obtain authorization from a nearby medical center, excusing them from work. In addition to paid sick leave, Soviet Russia became the first country where all workers, without exception, had right to an annual paid vacation. The Soviet government seized the beautiful countryside passes and country estates of the former aristocracy and opened them to workers and peasants for use at therapeutic resorts and communal vacation homes. All of these changes happened in Soviet Russia because all power went to the Soviets. This is the dictatorship that they wanted to protect. this isn't something strange and weird. Like the whole point of this, I'll try and find the source for that and put it in the description. But like, there's lots of writings about early Soviet Russia that you can just Google and find out about what life was actually like. This was not a dictatorship of Lenin. This was just implementing the land reforms and the nationalization and the workers' rights that they ran on. They were actually doing things with workers and peasants that they said they would do. That's why they were popular.
He was also refusing to work with other political parties
And he was refusing to work with other political parties because other political parties didn't want to do these things. As we just established, the Bolsheviks are the only ones who wanted to do these things. Why would he work with them? Why would he dilute their power by introducing people who did not share their goals? This was the whole point that we talk about with like democratic centralism, of that the whole party should be united. If people wanted to work with him, that believed in what they were doing, they would just join the Bolsheviks. And that's what happened. The SRs, the social revolutionaries that he talked about, the people that won that won those constitutional elections, those people, they themselves fractured into left and right wing. And the left wing, the left SRs, most of them all joined the Bolsheviks because they agreed with what Bolsheviks are doing. The only people by 1917, early 1918, that were still not in the Bolshevik party didn't agree. That's what it means. So like, he says this like knowing that like the average watchers of these things would be like American citizens who sort of view party politics as like, oh, you're either a Democrat or Republican. But like, no, the whole point was that the Bolsheviks had the will and the masses and the support of the people on their side. So anyone who wasn't a Bolshevik, any Mensheviks, any social revolutionaries who hadn't already joined the Bolshevik party were just straight up counter-revolutionary. They weren't interested in, doing what they were doing. And that didn't even mean that Lenin refused to work with them, because for a long time, Lenin still worked with the anarchists. Lenin still worked with the Mensheviks. Lenin still worked with the left social revolutionaries. All of these people in Soviet Russia, most of them still had uh, most of these people still had some form of power in the RSFSR. All of those people were still influential. Obviously, the Bolsheviks had the most influence, but left SR, some Mensheviks, they were still there. They still had roles to play. The Bolsheviks were going to work with whoever wanted to work with them. They wouldn't just work with every party for the sake of just being, the free and tolerant party, because they had a job to do. They were trying to protect and build the revolution. It wasn't anything of like, oh, we just need to accept anyone, even people that will betray us. They had a goal, they had a clear goal, and only people that were sympathetic to that goal they would work with.
cracking down on opposition. Hey, Lenin, are you setting up a dictatorship? I'll shoot you.
And it's funny that he says, "Oh, Lenin, are you setting up a dictatorship?" Look at how much time we've spent establishing that like the only dictatorship being set up was for the Soviets. The workers and peasants had marched under Soviet slogans: "All power to the Soviets, peace, land, and bread." Remember, this is still like late 1917, so World War One technically still hasn't ended by this point. Russia is still technically at this point fighting in World War One, and Lenin is trying to set up the means to allow them to leave that war. That's the whole point of all of this. So all this stuff about "I'll shoot you if you um are you setting up a dictatorship?" What he's talking about is a woman called Fanny Kaplan. And Fanny Kaplan was a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, and she viewed Lenin as a traitor to the revolution because the Bolsheviks enacted one party rule and banned her party. And why did they ban her party? Because the social revolutionaries that did not agree with the way that the Bolsheviks are doing things with all parts of the Soviets, that's the right SRs, because the left SRs had mostly they had mostly joined the, as I said earlier, the left SRs had joined the Bolsheviks. They were allied with the Bolsheviks. Like you see here, left SRs and Bolsheviks referred to the mainstream SR party as the right SR party. So this is the confusion. Fanny Kaplan was a right SR because the left SR had joined the Bolsheviks because they agreed with everything Lenin was doing. The people who didn't agree with everything Lenin was doing were the anarchists and the Narodniks and the right SRs who wanted to. They didn't believe that anything that was happening in this revolutionary context was relevant or correct. They wanted to stop all of it. That was why she tried to kill Lenin. That was why all of Lenin's health problems started alongside all the strokes and stuff, because people like this people like this were not supportive of the Bolshevik Revolution. They didn't want all power to the Soviets. They didn't want peace, land, and bread. They wanted something else. It doesn't matter what that something else was. They wanted something else. And all the masses and all the working people and all the peasants, they all wanted what the Bolsheviks wanted. Peace, land, and bread, all power to the Soviets. That's the context for this. It wasn't just a random, oh, Lenin is setting up a dictatorship and people don't want that. If you are someone who is capable of critical thought, you're already seeing over the course of this video how it's not true that the people didn't want what the Bolsheviks are doing. At every step of the way, from the end of World War One to the July days, at every step, the Bolshevik power had continued to grow. Even when the July days had risked, even when the Kerensky government had opportunistically tried to undermine the Bolshevik power during the July days, it backfired because the person he set up in charge as an alternative to the Bolsheviks ended up trying to betray the revolution, and he had to free the Bolsheviks to protect the revolution. And it just made the Bolsheviks so popular that by the time people within the Bolsheviks like Zinoviev and Kamenev were getting cold feet, and those people's names will come up later, Zinoviev and Kamenev. Those guys were getting cold feet and tried to betray the revolution one last time, which was why the Bolsheviks had to do the violent revolution and uprising, actually seize power, and immediately start to ban all the counter-revolutionary provisional government and all those other things that were seeking to undermine their power and prevent an actual proletarian uprising from happening. They were interested in a slow, gradual sort of creep to socialism because they themselves didn't believe that it was possible for a socialist revolution to happen in Soviet Russia, which at the time was still peasant and agrarian and mostly illiterate and mostly backwards. All of these things would be remedied by the socialists under the Soviets, under the authority of the Soviets, I should say. Everything that would change the fact that Soviet Russia was peasant and agrarian and backwards happened because of the Soviets, not because of any concessionary, revolutionary provisional government things. And even those elections in November that had been organized in February, they ignored all of that context. And it's just like, this is just so ahistorical. He's not informing anyone. He's not teaching anyone anything. He's just telling a story.
If you are, of course not. What a crazy theory. Anyway, I'm pleased to announce I'm setting up a secret police force to repress and kill traitors, and by...
And again, the reason why you can agree or disagree with the checker, I'm not someone who will tell you that the checker was some moral good thing, but like again, the context was set up to protect the revolution from reactionary forces such as the bourgeoisie and members of the clergy, because everyone except the Bolsheviks was trying to remove the Bolsheviks from power. This was the entire sort of the whole point of everything, was that the revolution has succeeded and now it needs to be protected. This is why anarchists always run into conflict with MLs, Marxist-Leninists, because they have this utopian viewpoints, just like the SRs, of like, oh, we are against all authoritarianism, we're against all sorts of violence, we're against all sorts of hierarchies. But like, if you have a revolution and people at every turn, all the people who you disempowered in the revolution, all the landowning classes, all the money classes, all the bourgeoisie, all the nobility, all the Russian Orthodox Church, if all those people are intending to violently overthrow a revolution, what are you going to do to protect yourselves? Of course, all the people in the Cheka were people that were sympathetic to the Soviet power. That's why they wanted to protect it. They wanted to protect the revolution from reactionary forces because those reactionary forces wanted to undermine the revolution. Obviously, in an ideal world, things like the Cheka, things like the KGB, things like the Stasi, those things wouldn't need to exist because, the reactionary forces would peacefully accept that their losses had occurred and they would just hand over power and everybody could go to bed peacefully at night. But people like Lenin have written consistently, even people like Marx wrote, that as ruling class power became more and more fragile, they would react more violently to protect it. So things like the Cheka, things like the KGB, things like the Stasi, you can say that like, yeah, you morally oppose them because they're bad or whatever, but like, you can't ignore the historical context of why they existed. And what Lenin is saying here, of that he set up a secret police to protect the revolution, that is the context for it. All of these people opposed Soviet power, and Soviet power was the overwhelming will of the workers and peasants in Soviet Russia. Therefore, anyone who was opposing Soviet power was trying to undermine the revolution and was aiding the bourgeoisie and the nobility and the moneyed classes and the monopoly capitalists, and Russian Orthodox Church, the clergy. Whether they intended to or not, that was the material result of their actions.
Traitors, I of course mean anyone not loyal to me.
And he says, not loyal to me. You can see how silly it is. Like this is the ideology that I was talking about.
I mean anyone not loyal.
He says, anyone not loyal to me. We just spent, look how long we spent talking about this. Like, it wasn't loyalty to Lenin. It was loyalty to the Soviets, to worker control. This is just like, the only people who can watch this and like take it as face value are people who just are incapable of critical thoughts, like full stop. They just cannot conceive of understanding these things for themselves.
To me. Owie, 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 owie. The assassination attempt made on Lenin's life in August 1918 failed, but in response, the Bolsheviks ramped up their oppression. But while all of this chaos was erupting,
and it says the Bolsheviks ramped up their oppression. Oppression of who? That's the question that you should ask. The attempt on Lenin's life failed, and the Bolsheviks ramped up their oppression. Who was being oppressed? Not the workers and peasants, because workers and peasants were for the Bolsheviks. They marched under Bolshevik slogans. They wanted all power to the Soviets. The people who wanted to kill Lenin, people wanted to kill Lenin like Fanny Kaplan. They did not want all power to the Soviets. They wanted the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, to be removed. And again, the whole thing you always have to ask yourself when you watch things like this is just like, does this follow? Does this track? Is there a sort of internal logic to all of this? In this video, hopefully, there's an internal logic to everything I've been saying. I don't think there's an internal logic to everything this guy has been saying. It's very disjointed. It's very disparate. Parts don't agree with one another. There's a dissonance to everything he's saying. And a discerning mind should be able to pick up on all of these things.
Up their oppression. But while all of this chaos was erupting back home, Lenin and the boys were also distracted by another problem. They were still at war with the Germans, and they had promised to give the people peace. So Lenin made Trotsky commissar for foreign affairs.
Lenin made Trotsky commissar for foreign affairs. And this is interesting because I just said earlier that like they were still at war and everything. And he made Trotsky the commissar for foreign affairs because he trusted that Trotsky would follow the Bolshevik line, because Trotsky had called himself a Bolshevik now. So he trusted that in viewing democratic centralism, Trotsky would follow the Bolshevik line and achieve peace with the Germans. This was what Lenin hoped Trotsky would do. Let's see what Trotsky actually does.
And sent him off to negotiate a peace deal with the Germans. The Germans offered Trotsky really harsh terms. You know,
they offered Trotsky really harsh terms because Germany was winning. Because Russia was completely Russia's capacity to fight the war was completely gone. They were categorically defeated. That's why the revolution happened. So to end the war, of course, you will have to accept harsh terms. Anyone who is a principled Marxist and committed to anti-imperialism will understand this. If we took power from imperials and we are trying to end the imperialist war that the imperials started, of course we'll accept whatever terms we have to accept, because our priority is giving people peace, land, and bread, like we said. We don't want to betray those people. Let's see what Trotsky does.
Because they were winning the war. They demanded Russia give up a butt ton of land, something that would be devastating to the economy. Look, I know it's not great, but I think we have to accept
something that will be devastating to the economy, not to the workers and peasants. And remember, when propagandists say the economy, they mean the moneyed landowning classes and the rate of profits and the people with stakeholders. They don't mean the workers and peasants. Workers and peasants wanted war. The idea that like giving up territory to end the war would devastate the economy, that's a very capitalist argument. That is not what someone like Leon Trotsky should be saying.
Are you insane? This will ruin us. Hey,
and again, look at this point. At this point, the people who are saying that they shouldn't leave the war, he doesn't really give the full. Let's just allow it play out.
You got a big brain. What do you think? How about no war, no peace?
And this is what Trotsky says: no war, no peace, which is just an insane proposition by him, where he wanted them to stop fighting, but they wouldn't sign the peace treaty, so that the Germans would see that they weren't fighting, and then they would just leave, which was insanely stupid because the Germans just advanced. Like,
so that, Mr. Trotsky, sir, it's simple. No war means we'll stop fighting the Germans, but no peace means we won't sign the peace treaty either. Then, when the Germans say we've just stopped fighting, they'll have to leave us alone or something. Trotsky, that's genius. I could kiss you.
And of course, Lenin did not. This is just propaganda. Lenin did not think no war, no peace was genius. We have documents from Trotsky, where he is at the peace treaties in January 1918. and he's asking Lenin. Trotsky's asking Lenin for permission to sort of he's asking Trotsky for permission of like what he thinks about Trotsky's plan. And Lenin is like, I want to consult Stalin before replying to your question. This is like an actual document that was this is telegraph communications by Lenin and Trotsky. And Lenin says that I want to consult Stalin before replying to your question. A delegation of the Kharkov Ukrainian Central Executive Committee, which has assured me that the Kiev Rada is on his last legs, is leaving today to join you. So the Kiev Rada was the counter-revolutionary sort of similar to the Russian provisional government. The Kharkiv Ukrainian Central Committee was like the Council of People Commissars for the Soviet Ukraine, and the Kiev Rada was like the people who were opposed to Soviet power. And then he says, sign as arrived, I'll discuss it with him. And he says that inform Trotsky, request arranged adjournment and return to Petrograd. So Lenin and Stalin are telling Trotsky that his plan is dumb, he should come back. That's basically what this telegraph is saying. Just to show that like Lenin was not some sycophant who loved Trotsky and wanted to kiss him or anything. Trotsky was dumb. Many Bolsheviks knew that they had to leave the war. The only people who opposed the Bolsheviks not leaving the war were people who didn't think that socialism in one country was possible. What's socialism in one country? Socialism in one country is the idea proposed by is the idea that like they could, because a lot of communist thought at the time was predicated on the idea that there would be a worldwide proletarian revolution and Russia would just be one part of it. Because remember, Russia at this point was a backwards country. It was mostly peasant, it was mostly agrarian. They were not, nobody expected that they would be the first ever socialist country. People thought that it would be like France or Germany, someone like that, an advanced industrial country with a proletarian base that could effectively take power from the bourgeois. They didn't think that a nation of workers and peasants would be able to take power from the bourgeoisie. This was the context for all of this. So the reason why people here didn't want Russia to leave the war was because they thought that by continuing to fight the war, but led by the Red Army instead of the Imperial Army, that if they would be able to sort of instigate communist revolutions in all of those other countries and continue proletarian internationalism. But again, we can see from history Stalin did not like this idea that Stalin didn't like this idea that the Red Army could go to Poland and force Poland to have a revolution. That was not going to happen but again, they had tried and failed because I'm starting to go on too many tangents. The point is that these guys believed in like a permanent war. Like they didn't want the war to end because they just thought that like we communists can, take charge of the war and use our Red Army to fight the war and force all these Eastern European countries that have been destroyed by World War One to build communism. And Stalin disagreed because the Soviet-Polish War. This is like very important. I know it might be like too distracting, but the Soviet-Polish War was a war that happened uh, soon after World War One, where soon after World War One, Russia sort of decided that they would try and export socialism to all those other places, basically, because the peace treaty that they're about to sign was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and that was a treaty that said that it gave all the territorial concessions and stuff. But people in the party who had influence at this time, Stalin didn't have much influence. Stalin was just like, he was just the general secretary of the party. He could do some stuff, but he wasn't like a total dictator or whatever. Lenin wasn't either. This is why the propaganda is so sort of like dissonance, because it's saying that Lenin started a dictatorship, but it's also showing that Lenin just couldn't do whatever he wanted. He's asking Trotsky, what do you think? He's asking them, what do we think? What are we going to do? Everything was by committee. Lenin wasn't just handing out edicts. But the point is that these guys, the Trotsky's faction, because in 1918, Trotsky still had a lot of power because he was in charge of the Red Army and he was very sort of like influential. But the point was that they felt that they could go to Poland and like basically force Poland to set up a Red Army. And what happened was that they lost because Poland actually won. And Stalin said that the stability of nations is not to be underestimated. If you read he said that the stability of nations is tremendously sought. If you read Marxism and National Question, this was the main theoretical work that Stalin wrote. He said that nationalism is one of the strongest forces in human society. And he says here that exporting revolution is nonsense. Each country can have a revolution if it wishes, but if it doesn't want it, there won't be a revolution. Our country wanted to have a revolution, and it did. So the idea of Trotsky saying that there should be no war, no peace, they should continue fighting, blah blah blah. At this point, he's not saying that yes, but he will say that later. It was proven to be wrong, and Stalin was proven to be correct. And because of that, Stalin was able to gain more legitimacy and more power, and these guys were able to, their reputations were tarnished a little bit.
Want me to kiss you? Stop asking me that. Trotsky's no war, no peace plan was a huge success. Oh, wait, no, just kidding. It went exactly as you'd imagine. When the Germans saw the Russians had stopped fighting, they slammed 700,000 troops deep into Russian territory with no resistance.
Of course they did, because anyone could see that that would have happened. And this was the thing that made them to move their capital from Petrograd to Moscow, because the German line was literally like a few hundred kilometers away from Petrograd. So that's why they moved capital to Moscow. That's why the capital of Russia is in Moscow now, because they moved it from Petrograd.
Now, the new peace treaty offered by the Germans was way worse.
And this is how Trotsky had disgraced himself. This is why they told Trotsky to come back to Petrograd, because his plan had failed totally, and Germany offered even harsher terms, and they were just like, okay, you've done enough, hurry up and come back.
Russia losing a huge amount of territory, population, and resources. The Bolsheviks had no choice but to accept, and Russia was humiliated.
So it says that, the Bolsheviks had no choice to accept, but whose fault was that? It was Trotsky's fault. And this is Stalin here. Stalin opposed all of this. Stalin wanted them to just end the war. Trotsky didn't. That will be important later.
With Petrograd now in an exposed position, Lenin moved the capital to Moscow, just in case. Things really weren't going well for Lenin, and many people were extremely unhappy with the Bolshevik government and its actions.
Why were they unhappy? They were unhappy because they... What's the point? You guys already know.
You've pissed off so many people that they've united against you. We're under attack. Relax. We always expected some counter-revolutionary pushback. I think we can handle it.
So this is the interesting part. What he's talking about here is the Russian Civil War. And the Russian Civil War, to just try to show you how insane the point he's making is, was a multi-party civil war. And the reason this war happened was because when Russia left World War I, when they signed the peace treaty, the people that it pissed off were the imperialists. So the imperialists decided to invade Russia and forcefully depose the Bolshevik government and put back the white government. This was the white armies, who were led by, bourgeois military generals and every anti-Bolshevik that you can think of. It was a very loose confederation. It was just basically just everybody that did not like communism. That was the whites. And then communists were, of course, the reds. So the whites movement was, obviously, this is the flag of Russia today, because when the Soviet Union was dissolved, people like Boris Yeltsin, they decided to basically just re-legitimize the whites movement as they were always right. But essentially, the main point is that the Russian Civil War happened because people didn't like that Russia had left World War I. The Allies didn't like that Russia had left World War I. And the interesting thing that you should also take note of is that in where was it? There was a time, where is here. We can see that in a Russia torn apart by civil war, pogroms and massacres against Jews considered to be those controlling Bolshevism at the order of the day. So the context is that in Soviet Russia, the Tsarist pogroms against Jews, minorities, ethnic minorities, the Alexander repression that guy talked about, that was just completely normal. The Bolsheviks, alongside everything else they did, the Bolsheviks were the only people who told everyone to stop fucking pogroming Jews because it was weird as fuck. So the new Soviet power is committed to stopping this terror. Tough new laws are issued, and Lenin demands the elimination of hostility against Jews and hatred of other nations. So he's cautioning against Great Russian chauvinism. Great Russian chauvinism on the part of Russians. He's telling Russians to stop hating Jews, stop hating other nationalities. Because, again, Bolsheviks are the party who wants to, champion the rights of nationalities and stuff like that. Britain, France, and the United States remained on the side of the whites, and at times they actively participate in bloody anti-Semitic agitation. In summer of 1918, the British forces that landed in northern Russia distributed anti-Semitic flyers by air on a massive scale. Some months later, pogroms of a tremendous dimension take place in which around 70,000 Jews lost their lives. They see that the Allies, then concentrated on their invasion of Russia, had secretly supported the pogroms. It's a preview, authoritative historians observe, to the crimes of Nazism and the extermination during World War II. And it's a preview that sees active British participation, leading the anti-Bolshevik crusade at the time. So the Russian Civil War is a reactionary war of imperialists, anti-communists, anti-Semites, everybody that has a vested interest in Bolsheviks not having power, because Bolsheviks were empowering workers and parents, they're empowering ethnic minorities, they're empowering Jews, they were taking steps to remove Russia from imperialist conflict. This was all. These are people that were upset. This is who Lenin was upsetting.
You angry monopoly men. But Lenin, it's not just the monopoly men. Okay, who are we up against? Well, the liberals, the social revolutionaries, national separatists in Poland, Finland, Ukraine, independent warlords.
So he says the liberals, social revolutionaries, that's the right SRs, not the left SRs, because left SRs had joined the Bolsheviks. The liberals and the left SRs were basically the anti, the sort of the. So he says the liberals. This is here. The left SRs, because left SRs had joined the Bolsheviks. The right SRs were against Bolsheviks. He says the national separatists in Finland, Poland, and Ukraine, these were all the right-wing governments who opposed Soviet power. You see the Ukrainian SSSR, the Finnish Soviet Republic, these people would not have opposed Bolshevik power. There's also, you see, the Finnish Socialist Workers' Republic, Red Finland. All of these people supported the Bolsheviks. The separatists in Finland, Poland, Ukraine, they opposed the Bolsheviks. So this is the context for all of this. This is the context for the people that Lenin is upsetting. He's not upsetting proletarians. He's upsetting people that want to betray the revolution.
Up chiefdoms, anarchist rebels, the Green Peasant armies, the Cossacks, the Caucasian states, the Baltic states, the British, the French, the Americans, and the Japanese. Oh, and a legion of Czechoslovakian soldiers seem to have taken over the Trans-Siberian Railway and stolen all the imperial gold reserves. What? How could this get any worse? Oh, and it says here your mother-in-law is coming to stay. No! A variety of anti-Bolshevik forces had united together to topple Lenin's government, and Russia descended into a full-blown civil war. Now,
so you see here that a variety of anti-Bolshevik forces had conspired to topple the Soviets' power. For all of these reasons, they were opposed to the Soviets' power. And remember that while all of this is going on, Soviet Russia is enacting workers' and peasants' reforms, it's enacting land reforms, it's trying to actually do the work of building socialism. But their efforts have been once again interrupted by external powers. And that is why Lenin had to implement war communism. He had to do all of those things that interrupted the reforms that had taken place. So this is, again, revolution happened, forces conspire to betray that revolution, things have to become harsh again.
The Russian Civil War was extremely intricate and would really need its own video, but essentially, the anti-Bolshevik white movement gained control of vast underdeveloped areas, while the Bolshevik Reds controlled the industrial heartland, using this to their advantage, along with the
And again, note that they had big population, all the industry, lots of railways. These guys just controlled the underdeveloped peasantry, and the peasants weren't really supporting them. They were just like there. So like they had all the territory, but they didn't have like the important things that you need to win a war, which is a proletarian base, industry, the support of the masses, and organization, and ideological discipline. These guys were a loose confederation of reactionaries who all had their various reasons for opposing the Bolsheviks, but they were not united. That's why they lost. And they also lost because the Bolsheviks had the support of workers and peasants, and these guys didn't. The workers and peasants were invested in protecting the revolution that happened in Russia, and these guys weren't. It wasn't just Lenin being a dictator. It was the work that had been done to organize them.
This to their advantage, along with the surprising military genius of Trotsky and the
surprising military genius of Trotsky. This is something that he says of just it's more ideology. Like, yes, Trotsky, I wouldn't really say Trotsky was a surprising military genius. I would say that Trotsky did a lot of things to organize the Red Army, including conscripting ex-Tsarist soldiers, which people initially didn't want because they wanted the Red Army to be like ideologically pure. And Trotsky instead filled it with like ex-Tsarist soldiers so that like they would win the war. And like it worked, but it had consequences because what happened was that the Red Army eventually became full of people who were not communists, and they didn't believe in socialism and they didn't believe in Soviet power. and this would have massive consequences later on, because when Lenin died and Stalin took power and like World War II was building up to happening, it would then be discovered that the Red Army was full of people that were basically just ready to betray the Soviet Union at the moment's notice. And if they didn't take steps to purge the Red Army, mostly of officers, but like a few peasants as well, if you like basically just lower ranking soldiers, but it was mostly officers. And this is something that like historians, again, they fully admit to all of this. The Red Army at first, when it formed, it was mostly just the Red Guards. It was mostly just those Red Guards we talked about that got reorganized into the Red Army itself. But later on, Trotsky then started introducing more and more Tsarist, introducing more and more. You see, in June 1918, Leon Trotsky abolished workers' control over the Red Army, and then replaced the election of officers with traditional army hierarchies and criminalizing dissent to the death penalty. And then he carried out a mass recruitment of officers from the old Imperial Russian army who were employed as military specialists. And then Trotsky would then enforce loyalty by holding their family hostages. And then by 1918, 75% of the officers were former Tsarists. And by mid-1920, there were 48,000. And basically, when the Civil War ended, ex-Tsarists were 83% of the command of the Red Army. So Trotsky, you can say, was like military genius or whatever, but like this was counter-revolutionary. Workers and peasants controlled the Red Army because they came from the Red Guards. Trotsky abolished that and decided to start putting ex-Tsarists in control. I can't believe that had consequences. So it's just like, yeah, this is history.
Disorganization of the White Army, the fortified Red Army gradually came out on top. It was an absolutely brutal conflict, with both sides committing horrendous atrocities.
Both sides committed horrendous atrocities. Like, yeah, liberals will always say those things as like lip service, but like he means that the Bolsheviks committed atrocities, and like that's wrong.
In order at home, the Bolsheviks began the Red Terror, and the secret.
You see, he says that the Bolsheviks began the Red Terror. What was the Red Terror? The Red Terror happened because this is something that like a critical thinker can like just ask themselves these questions. Again, the Cheka, we already discussed the Cheka before. The Cheka had the reason that they built Cheka was because people had tried to assassinate Lenin and the sort of like a Cheka leader in Petrograd. Counter-revolutionary forces were trying to undermine the revolution, so the Red Terror was modeled to protect the revolution. Of course, obviously there were bad things happen, but like we can't just say that like, oh, Lenin just did this thing because it was evil. No, it was responding to things. There are reasons.
Police would execute tens of thousands of suspected traitors. No one was safe from the violence, not even.
No one was safe from the violence, except all the workers and peasants who supported the Bolsheviks and who wanted all parts of the Soviets and who wanted the war to end. Those people were safe from the violence. People that weren't safe from the violence were people that were conspiring with and helping imperialist agents, the white movement, the allies, the national separatists in Finland, Poland, and Ukraine. The people who were doing all of these things were not safe from the violence because they were the targets of the violence, because they were themselves committing violence against the Bolsheviks and against the Bolshevik supporters. That is the context of all of this. It's not just like a comic book. The Bolsheviks aren't just the comic book villain, and then the white movement are the comic book heroes. It's like real life. There's three-dimensional reasons for these things, and the history is all there. And again, it's Wikipedia. It's not like it's the proletarian wiki or something. This is Wikipedia's most anti-communist source you'll ever find. If you search anything related to communism on Wikipedia, you will see everything I'm mentioning in this video is there on Wikipedia. And even Wikipedia has this information clear as day for anybody to see. So it's not some like strange thing.
Nicholas himself. You've probably been wondering what Nicholas has been up to this whole time. Well, after his abdication, he and his family were placed under house arrest. At first, they were allowed to live in their usual luxury, but after...
And you see, like, they were allowed to live under luxury when provisional government was in power because they were sympathetic to the money classes and the nobility and the landowning classes, and they allowed the captured, Tsar's families to continue living in like relative luxury while workers and peasants, as he states in this video, while workers and peasants were starving and their rights weren't met and everything that was going on. That was all fine. But basically, the sort of Tsarist exiled royal family were allowed to keep living in luxury.
Lenin took over, their conditions worsened.
When Lenin took over, that's when Lenin took over, when the Soviets took power, their conditions worsened because they could not afford to continue subsidizing their luxury.
The Bolsheviks were just holding on to Nick until they could work out what to do with him. But this
So again, this is where the dissonance of the propaganda arises. If Lenin was a dictator who had like all power, he was some unilateral autocratic like madman, why would they still be holding on to the ex to the Tsar's family and not knowing what to do with him? Because they couldn't decide. All these things had to be decided and they didn't know what to do with him. So they just, and remember, this isn't even the Petrograd Soviet. This is in Yekaterinburg. This is Bolsheviks in Yekaterinburg, which is like very far away from Petrograd and Moscow, but they're in Yekaterinburg. So this local group of Bolsheviks on their own were wondering what to do with him because they had authority. Lenin didn't have authority over them. He had some authority because the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the chairman, the Council of People's Commissars had authority, but it was limited authority. They still had a lot of regional authority. They had a lot of purview over their actions. They weren't just like puppets. They could do stuff. They could act, but they had to act in line with like the ideals and the priorities of the central government. That's why it was a federation. It was still a unitary country, but no, actually, it was a Soviet Russia was the RSFSR. So it was a federation, and they had a lot of federal authority compared to other Soviet republics that were central and were unitary. Although historians still somewhat have a consensus that, like, while Russia was a federation in name, in practice it was still very centralized and like there's give and take. But like the point was that Lenin didn't just order these guys to kill the Tsar's family. Like they decided on their own.
Civil War complicated things. The last thing they wanted was for Nick to be freed by the White armies. And so, to stop this from happening, Nicholas's Bolshevik guards decided to act. It's not entirely certain whether Lenin ordered it, or if the guards were acting on their own volition. But
Of course, it's not certain because it's impossible to know because it's not like there was like Twitter and stuff. But like it's almost certainly likely that Lenin had no idea these guys were going to do this. And if he did, whether or not he would have opposed it is for anyone to speculate about. It's likely that he could have seen reasons for and against keeping them alive, but ultimately, I would say that martyring the Tsars didn't really help the Bolsheviks. It wasn't really in their interest. It wasn't something that they would have seen as ideal. The ideal sort of if you look at the last emperor of China, this dude Puyi, this dude was the emperor of China when the communists took power, and they didn't kill him and his entire family. What they did to him was put him in like re-education and like make him an ordinary normal citizen. And the end result was that he eventually became sort of a a passionate supporter of the communists. He was reformed in his life and he became someone who believed in the communists, and he was rehabilitated in society, and he became an upstanding citizen. They didn't just martyr him. They didn't allow him to become a martyr for the anti-communist cause. They re-educated him, and he became someone who became an advocate for socialism. So this is probably along the lines of what Lenin and especially Stalin, because Mao wanted it, so it's likely that Stalin would have. This is probably what would have happened with the Tsars if they weren't just killed during Civil War. But again, who caused the Civil War? It wasn't the Bolsheviks, it was the whites. So the fact that they died, you can say that, yeah, the Bolsheviks shouldn't have killed them, but like, that's just history. That's what happened. And the unfortunate result was that the Tsars became martyrs, and everything that the Bolsheviks ever did would always be forever permanently colored by the fact that they massacred the Tsar's family. That's just the reality. And it's an educated guess that you can see that, like, if Lenin was asked, he would have probably said they should find another way. Maybe they should capture them, escape, do something else. But like they just killed them because that's just what happened. It was 1918. So like it's not like there was just so much sophisticated technology, and it was in Russia in 1918.
on July 17th, 1918, with white armies approaching, they woke Nicholas and his family in the middle of the night and brought them into the basement. There, a drunken squad of Bolsheviks murdered the entire family.
And of course, I just have to say that like the Tsar's family, it's such a powerful sort of like thing in Western society of like, oh my god, the innocent Tsar's family was so brutally murdered. But like if you look at like the amount of like human suffering that this guy was responsible for in Tsarist Russia, the workers and peasants went without food constantly. They had a human stampede because of this guy. I mean, so many people died meaningless, thankless deaths that history will never ever remember. But people only have sympathy for the perpetrator of that violence, in whose name that violence was committed. Him meeting an end that isn't that dissimilar to the people who died because of him. People have more sympathy for him than those people. And for me, that's just like, I mean, you can feel sad that the Tsar died or whatever, like that's fine. But like, if you have more empathy for the Tsar than the millions of workers and peasants that died in Tsarist Russia because of the Tsar's rule, then I guess we just don't agree. I just don't see how like that you can have that priority.
Nicholas, the last Tsar, once one of the most powerful men alive, had met a brutal end. But after years of fighting and millions of deaths, Trotsky and his Red Army came out victorious. Wow, that was a close one. Okay, back to creating a communist utopia. How are we doing
And
on
he
that?
says again, back to creating a communist utopia. This is just such a strange thing. Look at all that's happened. Why would what he's about to say is basically just that the civil war has destroyed Russia's economy, so it's no utopia. But like, of course it has, because that's what happens when wars happen. This is like the third war that Russia has fought since 1905. Of course they are completely destroyed and it's not a utopia, but no one expected it to be. They expected it to be a slow and gradual process, but that process was interrupted multiple times. We just saw the reforms that were happening in Soviet Russia. We saw that this is what was going on until the war started. The war had to interrupt all of this. Even with respect to disability rights, you see, this is sort of like a party organ that was established in the Council of People's Commissars. This is in 1921 while the war is happening. The All Russian Cooperative of Disabled People, the All Russian Union of the Blind, All Russian Union of the Deaf. These institutions were created by Soviet Russia to, integrate disabled Russians into society. This is the sort of thing that, like, when we talk about communism, when we talk about like socialism, when we talk about building a new society, things like the effort to do away with illiteracy among the blind began, the Cultural Revolution of sorts, clubs, houses of culture, red corners, blah blah blah. This is what we talk about what's happening in Soviet Russia during Civil War. So let's see what he says.
Well, the Civil War helped create a massive famine and about 5 million people starved to death. There's massive inflation and the ruble is worthless. Hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of railway track have been destroyed. Disease and epidemics have killed 3 million.
Destroyed by who? The white armies. The Bolsheviks would not destroy their own railways. Disease and epidemics are natural things that happen as a result of like various factors that don't have to do with human action.
The population of Moscow and Petrograd has collapsed. Life
Population in Moscow and Petrograd collapsed because of wars that were being fought there and people running away, and also people that were disagreeing with the Red Terror.
expectancy has plummeted.
Obviously, the targets of the Red Terror would leave Moscow and Petrograd because they are the targets of the Red Terror, and that's why there were so many emigres. Like in Oppenheimer, you see Boris Pash, Boris Pash, the anti-communist soldier who interrogates Oppenheimer. He fought in he fought in this war because he was an anti-communist and his dad was a Russian Orthodox priest or something, and he went to America because that's where anti-communists went. They didn't want to live in Soviet Russia because they didn't believe in communism. So that's why the population would collapse. Obviously, people died, but like there are also factors like that. And life expectancy has plummeted. Where did it plummet from? Where do you imagine life expectancy was when Bolsheviks took power in 1917 after Tsarist Russia? Like it can't have been high.
Sailors in Kronstadt are rebelling. People
So the Kronstadt rebellion is like a whole other thing that I could probably do a whole other video about, but like many people have talked about it before, including a Finnish Bolshevik. I'll put his video on Kronstadt rebellion in the description, but like there is absolutely no credence to that Kronstadt rebellion as any sort of like valid anti-Bolshevik. It was a completely opportunist sort of fake rebellion that was just purely intended to just help the whites win the civil war to undermine Bolshevik power in Kronstadt. And when people of Kronstadt realized what was happening, they immediately took control of the situation and opposed the fake revolutionaries that were doing that. It was just an anti-Bolshevik crackdown. It wasn't a real rebellion. You can read Grover Fur on this. You can read the Wikipedia, of course, like read it critically. You can watch Finball's video, but like yeah, it was a real thing.
are freezing to death in their own apartments and life has been
People are freezing to death because they are living under a war economy that has destroyed so much infrastructure, and most of the Soviet Union wasn't electrified anyway. So they're still freezing to death when Tsars were in power. It wasn't something that is just like, oh, communism caused all these things. These were the realities of living in Soviet Russia.
reduced to a constant search for food and shelter.
Life has been reduced to a constant search for food and shelter. Again, this is what generally happens when your country fights a war. And remember that war communism had implemented rationing. And the reason for that was because the urban areas needed food that the countryside had to provide. And remember, earlier in this video we talked about how um the um the czarist like reform guy had like instituted private farming to create rich peasants. Basically for this reason, so that in a situation like this, when they started nationalizing stuff, when they started rationing food and commodities, when they started collectivizing labor, those rich peasants would violently oppose it because they didn't want to lose their money. That's the context for all of this. These things didn't just happen because communism happened. There's context and reasons.
Whoa. Well, this just means I'll have to work twice as hard, day and night, to save the country. Nothing will stop me, short of a couple sudden strokes. Get the doctor. One thing you have to keep in mind is that everything I've been talking about, the Civil War, the assassination attempt, and Lenin's struggle to maintain control at home, were all happening around the same time, and it must have been extremely stressful. Lenin began getting headaches, insomnia, and in 1922, he suffered 2 separate strokes, as the Soviet Union was officially declared under a strict one-party system.
So again, Lenin was a very hard worker. This is something that every historian agrees on. And like, of course, yeah, his health struggled, and it wasn't anything that like was anything to do with like anything. It's not a feeling of. It's not some kind of moral feeling that he had bad health. He had bad health because people were trying to kill him all the time, and he worked hard. And yeah, the Soviet Union was created in 1922. That was after they added Belarus, they added Ukraine, they added all the Central Asian republics that had also carried out their own sort of like Bolshevik organizing, because Bolsheviks were popular in those places too. Armenian SSSR. By then, I think it was still like the Transcaucasian SSR and like all these other places too, and including like the Far East, because like there was a lot of lawlessness in the Far East, and they had to go in there and like establish control. That's really why the gulags really took off, because in the Far East, there was almost very little. So it was basically anarchism in the Far East, and there were lots of people that were just like carrying out senseless sort of violence and stuff. So the law enforcement structure that they had to come up with was the continuing the existing gulags that had existed under Tsarist Russia. Continue that, and it was reserved for people that were, trying to be menaces to society and not like peaceful citizens. Like, of course, you can oppose all those things, but like that was just the reality. That's just what happened. Understanding why things happen is so much better than just like moral posturing about like what should have happened, what was good or what was bad. Just understanding why things happen is so much better.
Strict one-party system. Lenin's health continued to decline, and his ability to lead the Communist Party went with it. Everybody assumed Trotsky would succeed him.
So this is this is the thing that I say. Everyone assumed Trotsky would. Why would they assume Trotsky would succeed? Trotsky didn't become a Bolshevik until 1917. We saw that Trotsky joined the Bolsheviks extremely late. Trotsky was the guy who decided to oppose war and peace. He decided to oppose peace by instituting no war, no peace. He abolished worker control of the Red Army, and he decided to start filling the Red Army with Tsarist officers. Trotsky was not some sort of like, like you might tell yourself like, oh, Trotsky was such a better like leader, but like that's not how Lenin thought. Lenin criticized Trotsky mercilessly. Like we see here, like Lenin was someone who had so much critique for Trotsky, and yeah, let's.
He was a great speaker. He'd won the Civil War, and he had a.
He'd won the Civil War. Like, I mean, yeah, sure, but like it's just so ahistorical.
Best train. The last person anyone expected to take over was Stalin.
The last person anyone expected to take over was Stalin, because Stalin didn't take over. This is something that again we'll see where like he's distorting history, because I guess his name is Oversimplified, so he's distorting history. What happened in the what happened in the Soviet Union when Lenin's health suffered was that Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev were a triumvirate. Remember, Kamenev and Zinoviev were the guys who earlier in this video, they were hesitant for the Bolsheviks to take power because they thought it would be too violent. And Lenin was like, no, we have to take power now. And then they ended up leaking Lenin's plans to the they ended up leaking his plans to the provisional government, Zinoviev and Kamenev. Here they are again as a triumvirate leading. And this happened May 1922 when Lenin suffered his first stroke. So until 1922, Lenin was fine, he was Gucci. May 1922, Lenin has a stroke, and then Stalin, Kamenev, Zinoviev ruled the party, not Trotsky. Because at this point, Trotsky is like, Lenin doesn't like him. He's part of the left opposition. He's part of all these like things that are undermining democratic centralism, and Lenin doesn't like that. Lenin likes Stalin because Stalin is a party guy. Stalin has been in the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Bolshevik Party since 1912, and he was a lifelong Central Committee member. He was someone that Lenin trusted because he was an intelligent guy. He had a lot of intelligent things to say. He had a lot of the official sort of like Marxist position on nationalities, Marxism and the national question. This was written by Stalin. It's a work of Marxist theory written by Stalin in 1913, and this is basically this book that he wrote became so popular that this book is why he started calling himself Stalin, because he was a revolutionary. He used lots of fake names because all those revolutionaries used fake names back then because they were always under threat of arrest. So it was this theory being published that caused him to actually change his name to Stalin, because this was like the work that like made him like a respected sort of Marxist thinker. And Lenin read this and he liked it, and that was why when the USSR was created, it was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, because Stalin had emphasized that they shouldn't be they should privilege the rights of national union republics to secede. But obviously the idea was that they would build up their national cultures and eventually they wouldn't want to secede. And Lenin accused Stalin of being a federalist, because Stalin didn't want central control of all these union republics under the one Russian banner. So even Lenin and Stalin themselves disagreed. But like overall point is that it's not some mysterious secret that Stalin gained power. Stalin gained power because Lenin put him as the position of general secretary of the Communist Party, because Lenin respected him and trusted his judgment. Stalin was the only guy who was a people's commissar of two things. Everyone else had one role. I think Stalin was people's commissar of labor and nothing, but like Lenin trusted him enough to give him important positions, because again, Occam's razor. Is it some mysterious secret fact of life, or did Lenin just trust Stalin more?
Stalin wasn't a great intellectual like Lenin.
Again, this is just complete insane propaganda. Stalin was a great. If you actually read Stalin, you will see that Stalin was a very smart guy, and obviously Stalin didn't think himself as up to the level of Lenin. There were lots of people who tried to like elevate him to like Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, or something, and like when you see the communism posters, and you see, Marx, Lenin, Stalin didn't support all of this. Like he wasn't in favor of all this. It was other people that did this because they respected him, and they even later on added Mao to this stuff. Like Stalin was an intelligent guy. Stalin made contributions to Marxism just like Mao did, just like Lenin did, just like Engels did. That's the point. This idea that Stalin is some bumbling idiot, and they just Western propaganda just tries to make it seem like Stalin was this dumb guy who just was conniving and scheming. He was a good politician, was a smart politician. That's why he could do these things. It's like the dissonance of this anti-communist propaganda, this imperialist propaganda, where it's like, oh, we have to simultaneously believe that Stalin was this all-powerful dictator who was able to like control people's thoughts, but at the same time, he was a bumbling idiot who couldn't add 2 + 2. Like, really.
Or a charismatic war hero like Trotsky. He was
a charismatic war hero, but he was still an important Bolshevik organizer who had a big role in the October Revolution by smuggling Lenin to safety. And he was the editor. Again, he was the editor of Pravda. Pravda was the daily newspaper of the Communist Party, and Stalin was the editor. You do not become the editor of a newspaper by being a dumb guy. And again, Stalin was basically the voice of the people. He was the editor of the daily newspaper that the workers and peasants of Russia supported in droves. The Menshevik newspaper was supported by bourgeois sort of like landowning. Like it had bourgeois support. Pravda had proletarian support. Stalin was the editor of Pravda. He was not a dumb guy. He was a very intelligent guy, and Lenin knew this. That's why Lenin made him general secretary of the Communist Party, because Stalin had the authority to give other people jobs and delegate tasks and keep up the day-to-day operations of the party. That's why Stalin was respected. That's why Stalin gained power, because by 1922, Stalin already had a lot of power because he was general secretary of the party.
As one Menshevik described him, a gray blur, someone who operated in the background.
Obviously, a Menshevik would describe Stalin as a gray blur because, they don't really think much of Stalin because, Stalin is someone who was himself Stalin is someone that was from Georgia. Stalin was a Georgian. He wasn't a Russian. He was born in Georgia and he was an ethnic Georgian. And people in the Mensheviks already thought very little of him. They called him they described him as having an Asian character. This is what Mensheviks said about Stalin. So this is someone who is already himself an ethnic minority, which is why his views on nationalism were so much more sophisticated than other Russian Marxists, because he actually had the ethnic Georgian upbringing and context to understand the minorities and nationalities in Eastern Europe and Central Asia that made them, specific and distinct. And he was a prolific writer. He published so much. He published so much writing. The idea that he was just some stupid guy is just complete nonsense. Like he was a very prolific thinker. He's someone that had a lot of respect from people, from ordinary people, and it wasn't just some magic. Oh, how did Stalin magically gain power? Like, it's very strange.
Someone who you might not even notice, but it was in the background that Stalin would rise to power. Here's how it
It was in the background that he rose power because they had a lot of popular support.
happened. After the revolution, all the Bolsheviks hoped to get a cool job in the new government. What did you get? Commissar for war. Sweet. What'd you get? Secretary.
So you see, again, this is the Western misunderstanding. Stalin was made a general secretary of the Stalin was made general secretary of the Communist Party. And this basically, obviously, he also had some military command during the Civil War, but like he mostly made mistakes and like was disgraced and stuff because he kind of like overestimated the importance of numerical superiority, and it caused to a lot of casualties and stuff. So like, but he learned from those things. It wasn't something like Tukhackevsky, this dude basically would become the biggest sort of catalyst of the Great Purge, because this guy ended up being like a traitor of the Soviet Union who was assisting Trotsky and everything. But like, main point was that basically Stalin was made the Communist Party secretary, and this wasn't a role that Lenin would have just given anybody. It wasn't some sort of demeaning thing. It was a very powerful role because he was good at the functional day-to-day. I mean, earlier in this video, Lenin talked about how he liked that Stalin was a go-getter and he could rob banks, he could raise funds. He was good at these tasks. That's why Lenin made him the general secretary. And general secretary of the Communist Party, it was originally bureaucracy. It was day-to-day tasks, and this guy was a newspaper editor. This guy was someone that was tasked with like a lot of menial tasks, but like you could do them effectively. And that's the only way that could ever happen if you're competent. So the idea that like, oh, everyone laughed at him for being the secretary, it's like, no, it was a very important role. Like, he had a lot of responsibility.
Stalin was made general secretary for the Communist Party. It wasn't what he wanted, but Stalin quickly realized that even though it wasn't fancy, it was a powerful position.
He quickly realized, of course, he knew that it was a powerful position. The first general secretary of the Communist Party was Yakov Sverdlov, who was a very important Bolshevik, more important than Stalin even. This was the guy who, basically, if he didn't die, he would have become the next leader after Lenin, not Stalin. Like, Yakov Sverdlov was a guy who, just like Stalin, was a very competent revolutionary. He was someone that, just like Lenin, just like all those other guys, he was an old Bolshevik. He was there from the beginning. He's someone that was extremely important. He was chairman of the Central Committee. So this is the type of people that were being made secretary. Elena Sasova, extremely important Bolshevik. She's a woman, but she still had a huge role in the Bolshevik party, loyal to the end. She wasn't purged because she was a Bolshevik. She was loyal. The people look at the. I mean, when people say these things, like, it just shows that they have not. Molotov, hugely important guy, hugely important guy. Like, these are people that, like, it wasn't secretary of like some demeaning thing. It was an important thing. And again, even though they made him general secretary, he was still I believe um, yeah, he was appointed to People's Commissars for Nationalities at the same time that he was also the general secretary. So this is something where like we have to pretend that Simon was this incompetent dude, but like he was very
As secretary,
competent.
he had the power to give people jobs within the party. So he would give jobs to all of his pals, who in turn would give him their support. The more pals he gave jobs, the more power he got. The more
And of course, he says it as like some sort of corrupt American bureaucracy thing, but like, yeah, dude, like if you're a party secretary and you're delegating tasks to people and you're generally someone who has ideological sort of like priorities, especially with respect to Lenin, you're going to give people jobs who support your party line, which is Lenin's party line, which is democratic centralism, which is socialism in one country, which is all these things. That is how he got popular support, by filling the party with and again, even that language is kind of misleading because even all of these appointments were still all these people were still communists. It wasn't like just like their job was like just be a politician and like they go my nine. Like they were people who believed fully in socialism and they believed in like all of these things. It wasn't just some strange thing of like it wasn't the Democrats. Like these were actual committed communists.
power he got, the more pals he got. Lenin may have been
And the thing is, because he did that, he was especially sensitive to betrayal and he was especially sensitive to people who were not ideologically disciplined, which is why he was an instigator of the purges. Because even Mao understood this. Regular purges is how you protect yourself and the party. Because Trotsky didn't take kindly to not being chosen. Even by the time Lenin was still alive, Trotsky was already saying insane things about like opposing Lenin. And by the time Lenin died, it was even worse. This was when Trotsky started actively funding like dissidents within the Soviet Union. That was why he was banned from the party. Why was Trotsky banned from the Communist Party? Like you can read these things for yourself and find out the reason why he was banned from the Communist Party was literally for this same exact thing. We can see the left opposition. Why did left opposition exist? Left opposition existed because they didn't want the new economic policy to end. They didn't want because the thing was after war communism, Lenin had conceded that the economy needed to recover itself and needed to start to like build up again. So basically, the um the left opposition argued that new economic policy had weakened Soviet Union, but Lenin uh Lenin supported the new economic policy because that was just the only choice that Soviet Russia had after the war because they had to like build up themselves. So new economic policy basically was just like a concession to capitalism. It allowed private enterprise, it allowed a free market that was subject to state control, it allowed profits to exist, and it was like a strategic retreat. But the state was still um, the chief actor and at the time, Stalin supported the NEP because Stalin supported Lenin. Stalin was very disciplined, but later on, Stalin would become very critical of the NEP, and Stalin would state that for the existential threats that both the Western powers and Nazi Germany posed to Soviet Russia and eventually the Soviet Union, that they would have to collectivize all the agriculture and forcefully industrialize as fast as possible. And end up working. Those are what the 5-year plans are. But like yeah, the idea that Trotsky was just some innocent guy who wanted to who was supposed to be the leader, but somehow he didn't like. No, he opposed Lenin. He opposed he opposed Lenin, and he continued to oppose Stalin until he tried and failed to basically carry out a coup. And then basically that was when Stalin accused him of factionalism and banned him from the party. And they were basically Stalin said that basically the party congress would decide that Trotsky's views were just not compatible with membership, and so they had to basically renounce them. And most of the guys like Zinoviev and Kamenev, they capitulated and they denounced Trotsky, but they of course secretly continued working with him to create the fifth column. But Trotsky himself was banned and he had to leave. They exiled him to Kazakhstan, and then eventually they exiled him from the USSR entirely. And that was how Trotsky spent the rest of his entire life in exile. And obviously the Moscow trials, obviously Wikipedia says that they're true trials because Wikipedia is anti-communist, but like the Trotskyite Zinoviev terrorist center was a real thing that happened, and every observer, including the U.S. embassy, the U.S. ambassador to the USSR at the time, observed that the trials were legitimate, and basically they concluded and found that Trotsky and Zinoviev had continued to conspire against Soviet Union throughout the 1930s, starting from when Trotsky was exiled. And yeah, that's just how these things happen. So obviously he's going to say in the video that Lenin died and Stalin magically gained power.
Having wall-to-wall strips, but he was still involved in the party, and he was taking notice. He wasn't a fan of Stalin abusing his position or insulting his wife to her face. Lenin knew he couldn't let Stalin take over, but by this stage,
Lenin did not know he couldn't let Stalin take over because otherwise he would not have made Stalin general secretary. He's about to talk about Lenin's testament, which is a document where it's purported that Lenin wrote that like Stalin was like ill-tempered and not suited for leadership and everything. The authenticity of that document has been severely called into question by basically every Soviet historian, especially the guys that are not committed to like even anti-communist ones. But especially Grover Furr and G.H. Getty are the main ones that I've seen where like they highly doubts the authenticity of the document into question. Because actually not just him, another guy too. I know Finn Wolfric has a video on this as well. But like the testament was created in 1923 when Lenin had like his last stroke. And then Lenin's wife apparently held on to that document throughout 1923, and then only in 1924 did she like introduce the document. And then the document basically said a bunch of mean things about Stalin and everybody else, but especially Stalin. And then Stalin humbly offered to resign. But then this act of humility is said to have saved him because everyone accepted that yeah, he was a flawed guy, but he was still Stalin, he was still their guy, and they made him stay. And like again, let's see
he was
what he
just too sick
says.
to fight it. Hey man, tell whoever's in charge of giving people jobs not to let that jerk Stalin become the next leader.
So again, this is the sort of like absurd propaganda where it's like Lenin told them to tell whoever is in charge of giving people jobs to not let Stalin become leader, and like
Who did I put in charge of giving
who did
people
I put
jobs?
in charge?
That would be Stalin,
And that
sir.
would be Stalin, sorry. And it of course doesn't make sense because why would Lenin make Stalin secretary if he didn't want him to become the leader? Like that's just completely absurd. And like yeah, I mean you can read for yourself the Lenin's testament. I know that like it might be boring, sort of it might be boring Wikipedia reading, but like this is how you can be informed of these things. And a number of modern historians doubt the authorship because he just had a stroke. This was someone who he had a stroke. His entire right side was paralyzed. He tried writing with his left hand. He had another stroke. He couldn't write anymore. Could barely talk. I mean, you could say, and the thing was that if they claim that it was dictated late 1922, early 1923, but it wasn't in the hope of Lenin's recovery. The testament was kept secret by his wife, and it was only after Lenin's death on January 19th, 1924, that she turned the document over and asked for it to be made available to the party congress. And again, remember, Zinoviev, Kamenev, these guys all basically hate Stalin at this point by 1924. They used to be a triumvirate, but they stopped being a triumvirate because they didn't like they didn't like how Stalin was carrying things out. And if we were to believe that like these guys in 1923 knew that there was a document saying there was a document by Lenin saying that Stalin was crazy, didn't let him take power, and they sat on it, and they allowed Stalin basically carry out his duties, continue to do his work all throughout 1923 and in January 1924. That's only when they finally allow the document to be read and sign off as to resign, and he doesn't resign, and they still maintain him. Obviously, we can start to ask ourselves like, is that really something that Zinoviev and Kamenev would have would have done if it was so urgent, if they were so like adamant that Stalin should not be allowed to take power? Because it's not like they weren't Like they weren't themselves trying to make it so that Stalin wouldn't take power. Like they were invested in Stalin not taking power. So like yeah, I mean the necessary stuff is what it is. You can believe what you want, but the reality was that Lenin and Stalin had a close relationship, and Lenin was someone that he did not do things like half-heartedly. He wouldn't just have given Stalin a bullshit job to silence him. He made Stalin general secretary of Communist Party because he believed that Stalin was a smart guy and he could do the job well, and that's just how history
Whoa.
unfolded.
Deja vu. Lenin's last wish was to not let Stalin take over, but by the time he died, Stalin was too powerful to remove.
He was too powerful to remove. How? How? You know, that's the thing. Is it was just too powerful to remove. He had done his job well and he had a lot of support. It would have been very difficult to remove him because he was doing his job.
Remaining opponents arrested or killed. Trotsky was banned.
He didn't have his remaining opponents arrested or killed. That's a very big oversimplification, but again, he's oversimplified, so
Banished and fled to Europe. Eventually,
he wasn't banished and fled to Europe. He was expelled from Communist Party because he was instigating factionalism and he was trying to get people to fucking overthrow Stalin as leader. He was trying to get people to form a united opposition and split from the Communist Party, and this was factionalism. This went against the principles of democratic centralism that Lenin had outlined when he created the party, when they first split from the Mensheviks. This is very basic things that anyone can Google for themselves and see. Democratic centralism is a principle of Marxism-Leninism, and it says that factionalism should not be encouraged. You should not make factions. You should not be factional. The party should be united. The reason why Trotsky was expelled from the party was because he was instigating factionalism. He tried to make a united opposition with Zinoviev and Kamenev and all of their supporters, and he tried to undermine the he tried to undermine Stalin's authority. And obviously, you can't do this. You can't do this. Of course, you can say that like it's not like parties should have disagreements, but disagreements should be resolved by consensus. And the consensus in the Bolshevik Party at the time was to follow Stalin's line. Trotsky going through back channels and trying to organize a united opposition, it was not democratically centralist. It was against party principles. That's why they expelled him. He wasn't just banished because Stalin didn't like him. He was expelled from the party and eventually expelled from the country because he was committed to undermining the country and the party.
He would be assassinated by Soviet spies in 1940.
It's not actually true that he was assassinated by Soviet spies. The guy that actually killed Trotsky, I think Finnish Bolshevik has a video as well. The guy that killed Trotsky was an ex-Trotskyist who became embarrassed and disillusioned by how pathetic Trotsky was and how his entire legacy was just so meaningless and how he just had such little influence and he became disillusioned. That was the guy that killed Trotsky. That was who he was. It wasn't it wasn't anything it wasn't anything to do with like Soviet spies or anything. It was a Mexican that killed Trotsky because that guy was a Trotskyist and he was someone who didn't like Trotsky. It wasn't anything to do with like there's never been any evidence whatsoever that Soviet spies or the Soviet Union or Stalin himself asked him to assassinate Trotsky. That's just completely not true.
Our dear comrade Lenin has died. We should have a state funeral. No, let's mummify him and put him on display.
This is also completely untrue. Finnish Bolshevik also has a video of this. Like the reason why Lenin was mummified was something extremely complicated. But basically, there was a Lenin funeral committee, and Stalin himself wasn't even part of that committee. What happened was that they had initially made it so that
So people can look at his dead body forever. That's gross. You're gross. Guards, kill him. Lenin had waited so long.
That's just completely not true. The reason why they built Lenin's mausoleum was because initially when Lenin died and everyone in the country found out, they had organized public viewing for people to come and pay respects because people were traveling from all over Russia to pay their respects to Lenin. They had organized a sort of like public viewing of his body. And it was originally supposed to last 3 days, but after 3 days, there were still people coming. There were still more crowds. So they built like a temporary sort of they built like just a temporary thing that would just be there just temporarily. But like after 2 weeks, people still kept on coming. And so there were guys who There were people there, uh basically the people within the funeral planning committee, they were debating like what should we do about his body because it's decomposing. The body started to decompose. The body started decomposing. So they were like, well, there's technology that exists to preserve the body, and if we preserve the body, we can still allow people to keep on viewing it. But if the body decomposes, then people won't be able to say anything anymore. So it was they just decided on their own that, well, these people keep coming to Moscow, to Red Square to view Lenin's body. We can't just send them away. People started like people were sending letters, people were sending all these things. It was like a mass surge of popular desire to view Lenin's body because people like Lenin. So it was then decided that they would just build this temporary structure and keep the body inside, and they would like preserve the body because again, the guys that were actually like again, Finch Wall Street has a video on this, but like the guys that were Stalin's associates, they didn't want the bodies to be preserved because they thought that would make them like the SRs, like the social revolutionaries who believed in like heroes and stuff. It wasn't communist to believe in like, oh, heroes, but like that's not really that's in real life. People have leaders, people have um popular leaders that they like and support, and so in reality, what ends up happening is that you always end up having to just acknowledge the people's wishes. If the people want to see Lenin and they keep coming and they keep they keep coming to view him, then you have to acquiesce to those demands. And it wasn't anything like strange or anything like that. It was just like a normal spontaneous thing that happened. And the thing is, the completion date was in 1930. Lenin died in 1924. So 6 years, 6 years, these guys had a planning community to decide what would be done with Lenin's body. Stalin didn't just decide that let's modify him and that was that. It was a long process, and there was lots of debates. There was a lot of there was a lot of like deliberation over what they would do, and it was just brought on by circumstances that they first allowed 3 days of public viewing before he'd be buried, but then people kept on coming, and then they couldn't send those people back, so they were just like, well, I guess we just have to just build this like temporary structure, and then eventually became like a proper thing. And initially, when Stalin died, they also embalmed him side by side with Lenin. But when Khrushchev took power and started the de-Stalinization because he said a bunch of like untrue things about Stalin, to discredit him and discredit the world socialist movement. They removed Stalin's body and put him in the necropolis. But like, yeah, Lenin's mausoleum is still open to public to this day on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Saturdays, and Sundays. You can still go there. His body is still there. Like, people still visit, but it's not as long as it used to be and stuff like that. Like, these things are. You can find out these things for yourself. It's not some like weird thing of, oh, let's modify him and they call him groups. Like, lots of people wanted to preserve Lenin's body. Stalin wasn't even part of the decision making process. So like, this is just completely untrue.
To take control in Russia, but he never got to see his communist utopia. His short time.
He never would see his communist utopia because no, he didn't believe in utopianism. He believed in materialism. He believed in scientifically building socialism gradually, deliberately, carefully. Like, this entire video was just completely insane to watch. But like, yeah, I mean, ultimately, like, the rest of the video was just some random Rise of the Kings and talking about the Cold War and stuff. But like, yeah, videos like this, I mean, 24 million views, just completely insane. Obviously, most of the comments will be like completely pro. But like, yeah, this is just insane. I mean, any Marxist that watches this video will just have almost like they'll barely be able to make it through. And honestly, this guy, this Midwestern Marx has responded to the Cold War video, which was like the follow up to this. So I'd recommend watching these two videos as well. But like, yeah, that was just I just had to react to that stuff.